It is a well-known fact among those near and dear to me that I haven't watched any movies. I have, of course, but people do tend to be shocked by just how many movies that everyone has seen I haven't. I've seen every Marvel movie, every Disney movie. Beyond that, it's like throwing a dark blind as to whether or not I've actually seen it. I've always wanted to watch more movies, but a movie is something I really want to have a chance to sit down and watch, and I don't tend to have a lot of time to do that. I wanted to give myself a push, so I decided to create a challenge for myself that would span the whole year of 2024. Films are not the whole of this challenge though. I used to read all the time. My mum always recounts the times that she would tell me to go outside to get some fresh air, and I'd take a book with me. Over the years I've read less and less, and that's a massive shame, so I wanted to try and find a way to read more, get back into a hobby I loved so much in my younger days. And TV as well. During uni, I watched a lot of Netflix, including a lot of series, and even all through the pandemic, I always had a series to binge. In the last couple of years, I found myself watching less and less shows, only really coming back for shows that I already loved, and this is a shame because I know when a show is really good, it can be a wonderful experience. The one hobby that has persisted has been video games. I've become used to playing the same few games on rotation, usually Picross, Pokémon and Smash, and haven't really tried to explore new games as much as I'd want, as well as letting myself build a backlog of games I simply haven't finished. Well, that ends now. In an attempt to capture the magic I once felt for each of these mediums, or just to become more explored in them, my challenge was to watch, read or play 24 of each. 24 books, 24 shows, 24 films and 24 games. Why 24? Well, it was initially going to be 12, one for each month. But I realised that would be far too easy, and 2 of each medium every month is actually not as difficult as you might expect. Also, the year is 2024, which I only realised after I had the idea to increase it, but any doubts I had about whether I should do that were eliminated as soon as I realised that. I've created a few rules that go with this, and they are as follows. I have to read 24 books, watch 24 films, watch 24 TV shows, and play 24 games to completion. For games, this usually just means up until the credits, which obviously can vary largely for different games, but I just see it as trying to any percent the games. I'm also not counting any DLC as necessary for this, although if I do happen to play DLC for a game, I will talk about it. In the case of video games, the challenge is twofold. I'll play 12 games that I've never played before, and 12 games I've played in the past but never finished. This also goes for TV shows, might as well address my backlog there too. I can only use one thing from every franchise. If I play a Pokemon game, I can't then include a Pokemon movie. If I watch a Marvel film, a Marvel book is now out of the question. This should help me to experience much more stuff, instead of getting stuck in the same old ruts. I'm only counting things I've watched, played and read entirely on my own. I do watch movies, play games and watch shows with my family and friends, but again, including these would make the whole challenge way too easy. I'm only counting the first 12 or 24 in any given category that I experience through the year. I know I'm likely to finish more than 12 games this year that I've never played before, but I'm only going to count the first 12 I end up playing. I'm going to go through each of these things I've experienced through the year and do a little review for each. I'm writing each of these relatively close to when I finish the thing I'm reviewing, depending on time, and I'm not going to go back and edit the entries, so you're very much getting my snap opinion, or as close as. I'll also be talking about them in the order I finished them. Oh, and I'm going to be going into spoilers for many of these, so I'll include a time code on screen to let you know where you can skip to if you don't want to get spoiled. With all the rules of this challenge over with, let's see what media I consumed in the year of our Lord 2024. I've always had an interest in Godzilla, but I've never actually watched a Godzilla film until early this year. I'd seen clips of Godzilla films and something about it always seemed so intriguing to me, but I'd never actually seen a full film. Well, I decided to finally dive into it with the 2014 adaptation of Godzilla, and it was... well, it felt like a bad way to be introduced to Godzilla. Don't get me wrong, the film was fine. I think my issue is that it didn't really feel like a Godzilla film. That may sound strange coming from someone who hasn't seen a Godzilla film before, but it feels like Godzilla is just kind of there. He's never the main threat, the Mutos are, and most of the film is dedicated to trying to stop the Mutos. Godzilla is, of course, the solution, but I don't know, with the film itself revolving more around the Mutos, and the bulk of it being spent with the human protagonists, Godzilla almost felt like a third wheel in his own movie. You could easily rewrite this to take Godzilla out, I feel, without much having to change. It's not even as if there was an abundance of cool fight scenes. The ending fights were great, exactly what I needed in my kaiju movie, but it took too long to actually get to it. And even where there were fights, sometimes they didn't even show them. It was pretty cheap to have Godzilla and the Mutos fight, but their fight was only seen briefly on a TV screen afterwards. There was still a bit in there, but not enough. Not for me at least. I did end up watching the rest of the MonsterVerse films, and they addressed my issues a lot more, but for this one specifically, while I still had a decent time with it, I was disappointed in how coy it played the whole thing. While making my Ciactro ranking video, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole trying to find a bunch of super cheap, low poly indie game platformers. Lunistice was one I only found out about because of its Tori crossover, so I figured I might as well give it a shot, seeing as I love me a good bit of Tori content. Well, as it turns out, Lunistice is excellent. My first impression was how good it looked. It's low poly, sure, but I found it easy to forget that at times. It's weird. It's obviously low poly, but the visuals are just so nicely handled that it doesn't look that way. Every world is so pretty, and it made it genuinely a delight to play through. The music too is sublime. Pretty much every track in the game is a hit in my books. It has a pretty intriguing plot too, told mostly through notes that can be unlocked by collecting things in the levels, and the worlds all look and feel very creatively designed and intriguing. As well as this, the gameplay is excellent. You essentially have a triple jump open to you, with 2 regular jumps and a spin attack that can act as a third jump. Stringing these together is really satisfying. I found that the speed-based gameplay was very fun too, although there were several sections that slowed down for an unnecessarily annoying platforming section. I also felt like checkpoints were a bit inconsistently placed, and sometimes I would die and be sent back way further than felt reasonable. Overall, these are small issues, and I loved Lunistice all the way through. It's been a long time since I read a Diary of a Wimpy Kid book. The original was my favourite book as a kid, and I still have a lot of love for it now. I continued reading the books into my adulthood, but eventually I missed one of the books a few years ago and never bothered reading any after that. This year, however, a good friend of mine who also still reads the book sent me the most recent entry as a Christmas present, and so I decided that the book I would use to try and launch back into reading this year would be this one. After all, it is a relatively quick read and easily digestible. Modern Diary of a Wimpy Kid, in my opinion, is a shell of what it was. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with diary books, to the point where I started writing my own diary, something I still keep up to this day. When I stopped reading the books, part of my disinterest was that it didn't feel like a diary anymore. This book kinda does the same. You could just write this story as a regular first-person book with pictures, and not a heck of a lot would have to change. It takes away a lot of the appeal. This book also didn't feel particularly personal, and what I mean is that almost the entire book talks about things that happen in the school, but none of it really seems to involve Greg, so it almost feels like him commenting on things he observes as a third party. A knock-on effect of this is that many of the characters are barely mentioned, including Rowley, which is weird considering the book focuses on Greg's time at school. I feel like focusing entirely on one section of Greg's life is a strategy to make each book stand out, but it just ends up feeling imbalanced and feels much less like a snapshot of Greg's life and more like a story about his life. There is a difference there. I always preferred when Wimpy Kid books had all sorts of different storylines going on, which ended up converging at the end, especially as it all took place over a year. I also feel like the fact that I'm a teacher hurt my enjoyment of the book, because so much of what happened in it just doesn't make sense under safeguarding policies that any school would need to use, and the absurdity of certain things was just a bit much for me. It's a kid's book, obviously, but the logic, for example, behind sending students to a random school assigned alphabetically rather than based on catchment area felt really off to me, and then the idea that Alex Aruda dropping out would cause everyone to have the opposite school, when many other students dropping out had absolutely no effect. It felt like a really weird plot point, and there's no reason for it to be that way. But for all my gripes, it's still Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and there were some great parts. Firstly, the principal for a day part was fantastic. Again, so unrealistic, but realism be damned, this was such a fun concept. Just imagining everyone actually treating this kid as if he was the person in charge of the school was hilarious, and it got a lot out of that concept. Plus, tying it all together at the end with the pig kissing felt like classic Wimpy kid again. I also loved the recurring gag with the cleaner robot. It never failed to be entertaining, no matter how many times it popped up. Seeing Greg actually really fall on his feet in the new school was also really nice. At the end of the day, this is a series of books made for kids, and I can imagine it would be fun for any kid. But it feels like the later books in the series have lost a lot of what made it more enjoyable to all ages, and this book is a symptom of that. I'm not a Sonic fan, not really. I've played a fair few Sonic games, but the only one I really love is Sonic Mania. Because of this, the Sonic films never had a massive appeal to me, but I figured I might as well check them out. Last year I watched the original movie, and I thought it was fine. But this year I decided to watch the second movie, and I liked it a lot more. First half of the movie actually didn't interest me so much. Sure, it has a few cool things, but overall it felt like the first film again. Too much focus on the human element, not a massive amount of actual option, and pop culture references that didn't feel natural and were often forced in there for the sake of it. Then came the wedding scene, and it kinda doubled down on the issue of there being too much of the humans, but it was actually one of my favourite parts of the movie. The gag with the different people being revealed to be gun agents was funny, and I just felt like it was a really fun, solid scene, held back by the fact that it doesn't fit in this film. But still, from this point I started having a lot more fun. I loved seeing Sonic bond with both Tails and Knuckles was such a fun character. Seeing the three of them team up at the end was awesome, and I think it made me realise that this is what the film always should have been. It felt like finally getting a Sonic the Hedgehog movie, truly. Oh, and the Supersonic scene was, of course, fantastic. My one hold up is actually Eggman. I've never really felt like Jim Carrey is a good Eggman. He is an engaging character, but it is basically just typical crazy Jim Carrey character. Eggman is a mad scientist type, sure, but he isn't weirdo insane. I've always felt like he is a lot more dry in his delivery, and seeing him just bouncing off the walls never felt right. That said, some of the true Eggman feels like it pops up every so often. It just feels like it's not a proper Eggman adaptation. But that's small potatoes really. Overall, this film, when it got going, was a blast, and I'm actually kind of interested in the next one now. In keeping with the rules of this challenge, I'm only allowed one Marvel film, show, book, or game. This is the one I chose. I regret everything. This movie was so boring. I knew people said it was bad to an unbelievable level, but I wasn't prepared for how boring the whole thing was. I was just waiting for it to be over, and frankly I'm glad I was making myself dinner at the time, because if I had to watch that without doing anything else, I may not have survived the experience. My one positive was that Milo was pretty alright, but that's mostly due to Matt Smith being awesome. And even then, the character was handled so badly. I get the idea that he's so desperate for a cure that he'll do anything, but nothing about his character seemed even close to that level before he turned. I knew he was the villain, obviously, but it still felt really out of nowhere when it actually happened. Michael Morbius himself, on the other hand, had almost no personality. Like, I know he's a scientist, I know he has an illness that heavily limits his life, I know he's trying to find a cure, I know what he is, but I never get a sense for who he is. That actually goes for every other character. I couldn't tell you another character's name, or even what other characters there were. Even writing this now, I can barely remember anything about the plot. Honestly, it could have been so much better, and I'm so sad I never got a chance to see it in cinemas, because this release of the film doesn't have the famous Morbin time scene. Seriously, they shouldn't have cut that out. Seeing Michael Morbius morbled over the place would undoubtedly have improved it so much. The true tragedy of our time. I already covered this one in my Ciactro ranking, so I won't spend too much time on it here. The game was released as a bonus with the Super Kiwi 64 soundtrack, acting as something of a prequel to it, and has you controlling a dog in a helicopter who has to sneak past zombie robots in order to escape. It's quite tense at times, especially when the robots spot you and come chasing after you, but I'm not super into this type of game, so while I enjoyed it, I didn't enjoy it as much as I could. The main thing I love about this game is the distribution method. The idea of a bonus game coming with a soundtrack release is just such a cool idea, and I'm really glad we got this. I honestly don't know what I think about KUUKIYOMI, and unfortunately, I don't think much about it will stick with me. So the idea behind the game is to try and be as considerate as possible. You're given small scenarios like choosing where to go on a date or ordering drinks for everyone in your group, and you can choose whether or not to be considerate. There's no real penalty for not being considerate, nor a reward for being considerate, outside of a chart at the end of the game that shows you what different attributes you displayed through your actions. I think this is where the problems start. The scenarios just kinda end once you've done whatever you choose to do, and you never see what it leads to, outside of a few scenarios that return later down the line, like the ongoing date scenario between a male and a female. It doesn't really feel like my actions matter, and the chart at the end doesn't help much because I don't know what scenarios actually led to what. I also didn't always feel like it was clear why any given scenario was about being considerate. Many scenarios just felt a bit too disconnected from that theme. Many scenarios were just unclear as to what you were supposed to do. This could either be because the controls were weird, or because it wasn't conveyed well what the actual scenario was. Sometimes it was so unclear that I made just a small movement and seemingly failed. Sometimes I was completely clueless as to whether I'd done what is supposed to be considerate or not. This could also have been partially due to the fact that it's clearly translated from Japanese. Maybe there was something lost in translation, but most of the game hasn't got any dialogue, so I don't think it's that. This game had some cute little moments, and I got it pretty cheap, so it wasn't exactly a waste, but I just didn't get it. Nice idea, not sure about the execution. I've always loved 2D platformers, and Grapple Dog has always been on my radar, but never to the point that I took the chance to actually buy it. But I saw a video recommending it, and it doesn't cost much, so I decided to give it a try. And I ended up really enjoying it. You play as a dog with a grapple gun, which lets him swing from certain surfaces, although not everything. At first I was a bit disappointed that I couldn't Spider-Man through everything, but it makes sense. Not having any limit on where you can grapple would make it ever so slightly broken, so it makes sense. And at first I was a little underwhelmed by how few chances there actually were to use the grapple gun, but past the first couple of levels it becomes much more heavily utilised, and makes for very interesting action puzzle platforming, where you have to figure out how to get past any given obstacle using the grapple gun. There are other mechanics you can use. You can climb up walls that have plants growing up them, and you also have a ground pound, which has plenty of varied uses. The moveset is simple enough, but it makes for a lot of different scenarios, and it never stops being interesting. The bosses also present a good challenge, although a couple of the later ones can be a little frustrating. But the final boss is pretty much everything I wanted it to be. My biggest complaint would have to be the progress gating. Through the game you collect gems. There are 5 gems hidden throughout each level, plus 2 extra gems for collecting enough berries. There are also challenge levels, which each give you 3 gems for completing. As a collectible, this is great and adds a lot more for the player to do. The issue is that each of the boss levels requires you to have collected a certain amount of these gems before you can take it on. In the earlier levels, where the gems are easier to collect and the number of required gems is less, this isn't an issue. But I was halted before the final level because I was about 30 gems short of the requirement, and it needlessly killed the momentum I had in the game, and forced me to go back and replay levels in order to get the rest of the gems. With the limited time I have in my evenings, this actually took a few days for me to do, and I almost felt like putting it off entirely. Grapple Dog is far from the first game to take this policy to progression, but I think it is a really bad design choice which has no real benefit to the player, and made this portion of the game painful and unfun. It's a shame that this issue had such a significant effect on my experience of the game, because everything else it does is awesome. I love the look. It's a little pixelated, but that just seems to be the style it's going for, and it looks fantastic. Plus the soundtrack is excellent, and the gameplay and level design is worth playing alone. In the end, that little grinding issue is not enough to stop me from highly recommending this. I've obviously had a very heavy obsession with indie retro 3D platformers. With games like Super Kiwi 64 and Lunistice, it has become something I have a big focus on, but finding games in that very specific style is hard. I'm usually looking for something somewhere between Penny's Big Breakaway and Whittle Tree. You know, something that very much gives the vibe of being made by one guy who just wanted to make a game, but also feels really polished for what it is. Imagine my shock and joy then when I saw the Celeste team announce Celeste 64 Fragments of the Mountain. It's essentially Celeste as a retro 3D platformer, and while not made by a primarily one-man team like Tori 3D for example, it was apparently made in little more than a week, which kind of gives it that same vibe. So my favourite game has been adapted into one of my favourite genres, and how is it? Fantastic. Celeste has been replicated so incredibly well in this style. While there are some changes, such as no stamina meter, or the fact that dashing can only be done diagonally upwards now, it otherwise feels incredibly loyal to the original gameplay, and there's some new tech which is very fun to pull off. The game, instead of being a linear game, is a collectathon world with 30 strawberries to collect, some being in Super Mario Sunshine inspired sub-levels. The music for those bits is a really awesome callback to Sunshine, although given how hard these sub-levels can be, it can get a bit annoying after a while. And while some of the sub-levels are very difficult, I don't think it ever gets too hard. As with the original game, dying takes little to no time, so you can throw yourself at a challenge over and over until you learn the tricks to beating it. It took me about 4 hours to 100% it, with the last half hour being mainly because I couldn't find a couple of the strawberries rather than them being difficult, but I never needed to use a guide and I'm quite glad about that. I think the only significant criticism I can level at it is that it just isn't as good as Celeste, but Celeste is already my favourite game of all time, an absolute masterclass of game design, possibly the greatest in its genre ever, so being able to do the same here would have been nothing short of impressive, and the fact is they still made it feel like a very polished, very enjoyable game, so this isn't even much of a criticism. This release was everything I could ever have wanted. I tried to do this challenge last year, although instead of trying to consume 24 of each medium, I was only going for 12. I ended up giving up early in the year, but one of the films I watched back then was Knives Out. I do like a good mystery, and with an intriguing cast of characters and a very interesting mystery presented in a very unique way, it checked a lot of boxes for me. When it came to Glass Onion, I was worried I wouldn't be as into it. The investment in the characters, especially Marta, was one of the things that I loved about the first film, and with only Benoit Blanc continuing into this movie, I thought I would just not like it as much. I can't honestly say which movie I prefer because I still ended up really liking Glass Onion. Blanc himself is a very compelling character to watch, and when he's making one of his speeches, it's always a hoot. But the actual mystery here, while not immediately apparent, is quite gripping once it gets going. The new characters are all interesting, but Helen is the absolute star as soon as it's revealed that it's her doing this. Going back through the events of the movie with that new context added feels weird at first, but it actually works and I greatly enjoyed the climax, especially Blanc getting increasingly more frustrated at the fact that Miles somehow managed to evade his suspicion through absolutely no intelligent thought of his own. I do feel like some parts of the climax are kinda weird. Don't get me wrong, the fact that everyone didn't die is a good thing, but they were all inside an exploding building and they were just okay? I feel like that wasn't explained very well. I also feel like everyone turning on Miles was a bit weird, both because to do so requires them admitting to lying in court, which they don't have much incentive to do, but also because it felt like destroying everything he had, including his business, was meant to be the overall victory to make up for the fact that he had made it impossible to prove he did not write on the napkin. And I think making it so that everyone actually does turn on him felt a little bit too much of a perfect ending. It doesn't matter a massive amount though, because overall the film was a blast and I hope we get more films in this series. I decided to watch Pokémon Concierge on a complete whim. I wanted something to watch before bed and this popped up on my Netflix feed and I figured, why not? It's only 4 episodes and it didn't take too long to watch. Plus I've always enjoyed the animated miniseries that Pokemon has had, and stop motion is always a fun animation style. Well, in terms of the actual animation, I mostly love it. It's so cute and cozy in the best way. So many of the Pokemon are absolutely adorable, especially the ones made of felt. They're so fuzzy, I love them. Not every Pokemon is made of felt, and I actually think that was somewhat a mistake. Some of them, like Graveler and Metagross, it makes sense for, and the same goes for Pokemon like Mudkip, but these Pokemon just don't look as appealing to me. And while it makes complete sense because they aren't furry Pokemon, neither is Dragonite, and they made that out of felt, so I feel like making all the Pokemon out of felt may have just been a better way to go. I feel similarly about the human characters, by far the weakest visual element. Not only do they look plasticky, but their hair is so stiff and lifeless a lot of the time. It is a shame that a series with such a lovely visual style has these rather obvious blemishes. Outside of that though, I had such a lovely time with this series. I like how, despite obviously being appropriate for kids, the series is from the point of view of someone who is explicitly an adult, with adult problems that I personally found kind of relatable. It doesn't necessarily feel mature, but it does feel like it's made with a mature audience in mind. Haru was a very likeable character, and I loved when I found out that she was voiced by Karen Fukuhara, who also voiced Kipo in Kipo and the Age of the Wonder Beasts, one of my favourite cartoons, and I frankly cannot believe I didn't pick up on that sooner. The plot of the episodes is cute. The first episode is all about Haru finding her feet in the hotel, but then each subsequent episode has her helping out one of the Pokemon guests with whatever they need help with. It's very slice of life and very relaxing and sweet, and I love the relationship between Haru and Psyduck. I also love the last episode with the shy Pikachu. The only real issue I have is that it's very short. This on its own isn't too big an issue, but it does mean that Haru's development is quite sudden. The first episode is her first day, the second is immediately afterwards when she befriends Psyduck. Then both the following episodes are her helping Magikarp and Pikachu respectively, but it's implied by the fourth episode that she's been doing it a decent amount of time at this point, even though we haven't actually seen almost any of this. It's just kind of sudden, and more episodes would absolutely help this, as it would give us a greater feel for her progression in the job. In the end though, it wasn't a massive deal, and I'd imagine how much time stop motion can take is a big reason as to why there's so little of it. I really liked it, and I would really like to see more of this type of animation for Pokemon in the future. Picross is one of the Nintendo series that I have put the most time into. It's my unwinding game, a game that I can always play when I'm tired at the end of the day. I started with Picross DS and have since played the first 4 Picross S games, and am currently playing through the 5th. These games are amongst my highest playtimes on the Switch, and combined it beats out any other series. I haven't necessarily searched out other nonogram-based games, but I received Pixel Cross Adventure alongside another game, PictoQuest The Cursed Gift, as a Christmas gift. PictoQuest is more different mechanically, but Pixel Cross Adventure was far more interesting to me. The actual puzzles are basically exactly the same as Picross, but the interesting part about the game is that it has an overworld to explore, as well as a narrative. This isn't the deepest world to explore, but it's fun having the game presented this way, and it has plenty of charm. Plus there are little secrets that you can find. It isn't perfect. Picross has perfected the controls for a nonogram game, and Pixel Cross just feels a little bit more unrefined in that department, but it isn't a massive deal and I got used to it. What may be a little more of a deal breaker is that the game is far easier than a Picross game. The puzzles rarely took more than 5 minutes, often much shorter. I also felt like the difficulty didn't increase as the game went on. You earn EXP from completing puzzles and gain levels, but all this does is allow you to do puzzles that are gated by level requirements. The gated puzzles aren't any harder though, so it's mainly a way to artificially gate progress. With that said, my main reason to play a nonogram game is to relax, so it being a bit easier isn't an issue. In a way, being able to do short puzzles and see the world fill out was great. I ended up 100%ing this game, so it was definitely worth my while, and the adventure framing of the game makes it probably my favourite nonogram game on the Switch, even more than Picross games which, while functional and satisfying, feel a little sanitised at times. Either way, I am glad I was able to play a unique take on a nonogram game. Guys. This might be one of the best 3D platformers I have ever played, one of the best games I've ever played. It's genuinely extraordinary. I completed the game less than an hour ago at time of writing, and I just have to write down my thoughts because my mind is buzzing with everything this game has made me experience. I was interested from the moment I saw it, and I'd been waiting for the release date to be announced, so seeing it shadow drop after the partner showcase was incredibly exciting. I downloaded it straight away and gave it a try. I came to the conclusion that it's one of the best 3D platformers I've ever played by the second level, and at no point did I have cause to question that. It hits you immediately with a heavy dose of character, quirky, unique visual style, and a soundtrack to die for, but the star of the show is the gameplay and controls. There are so many options for movement. Obviously you can move around and jump, but then you have your yo-yo moves. You can use your yo-yo to break objects or spin it around, but that is only the start. When in midair, you can use it for a slightly boosted second jump, or you can use it to do a big horizontal boost. or have it stay in the air so you can swing off it, and when you're grounded you can use the yo-yo as a pair of wheels to gain speed as long as you have hills to build momentum on. Basically, imagine this, a game which combines the aerial acrobatics of Super Mario Odyssey with the speed and momentum based gameplay of a good 2D Sonic game, and that's Penny's Big Breakaway, and that gameplay had me obsessed. And the game has so many ideas, every level feels like it introduces some new mechanic, and pretty much every one hits. I also love that there largely aren't any enemies aside from the penguins. The penguins alone cannot hurt you, but they instead grab onto you, and if 5 penguins manage this, then you'll be captured, which basically means you lose 1 bar of health and have to respawn at the last checkpoint. You can avoid this by using your yo-yo to shake them off. I like this unique take on the idea of enemies. This game always has something fun and interesting in store at every point. The only real negative I have about this game is the final boss, where some of the elements just don't feel like they work properly, and having no checkpoints in a multi-phase battle is very frustrating. I also did sometimes find it a bit buggy, and there were times when I would accidentally fall through a floor or wall, or get stuck on or in the geometry, but this wasn't too big an issue, and it was more funny than anything. This game blew me away, and I think it's going to be one that I end up returning to over and over and over again. I didn't really know much about Lucifer before watching it. I'd heard of it and had been interested in watching it, although mainly because I'd already enjoyed Tom Ellis in the British comedy series Miranda, but I didn't actually know much about it other than, hey, Tom Ellis is the devil. But one of my best friends is a fan of it, so I decided last year to start to watch it. I didn't realise it was a detective show until I started watching it, and that was a nice surprise because I like me a good detective show every once in a while. Other than that though, it's exactly what I expected it to be. A show that hinges on its characters, and they're really good characters honestly. Lucifer himself feels like a standout, a very self-centered character on the surface who likes to fulfill his every desire and bring out the desires of others. But it's apparent very early on that he has a strict moral code. He never lies and he wants to see the sinful punished, which feeds into the actual mythology of the devil quite nicely. Over the series, Lucifer creates more bonds and connections, as well as unravelling his own trauma and reconnecting with his family. This is great to see the further it goes on, although it does uncover one of my issues with the series. No matter how profound the revelation he has, he's always as butt-headed and arrogant in the next episode. It can be a little frustrating to watch, and plot points can feel a little repetitive. I like a lot of the other characters, but I don't like all the character decisions that were made. Maze is the prime example for me, as it feels like half the time they couldn't think of an interesting way to take her character, so they just made her evil. Then there's Ella, who ended up being my favourite character, but I don't like that she actually ended up finding out about Lucifer being the devil, because it felt like the entire point of her being religious was that her faith was based on believing without being able to actually see it for herself. It kind of felt like her finding out undermined that. Talking of the actual supernatural side, this was a great part of the show. It helped make it feel distinct from other detective shows, and seeing how they introduced different biblical figures was always fun. I also like the fact that they showed different characters reacting to the truth that Lucifer is actually the devil in different ways. The show has a lot of humour, and I especially loved the episode Daniel Espinosa, Naked and Unafraid, which came together gloriously in the end, and has probably my favourite F-bomb ever. Overall, I enjoyed my time with Lucifer, and I think the way it ended, while somewhat bittersweet, was the right way to end it. I don't know what to think of the Hollow Chocolate Bunnies of the Apocalypse. It's been sitting on my bookshelf for a literal decade, and I've always said I wanted to get around to reading it, but never did. Well, a challenge like this gives me a reason to, and I'm glad I did, even though I don't really know how to feel about it. My opinion was all over the place. It has an absurdity to it that reminds me of Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, but it doesn't quite work for me as well as Discworld. It's essentially a detective story set within Toy City, formerly Toy Town, and the references to toys and nursery rhymes were pretty fun a lot of the time. But then sometimes the plot felt like it wasn't going anywhere, or it felt a bit messy, and sometimes it felt like things were explained in a very drawn out way, mainly because characters kept getting interrupted or interrupted themselves, and that was annoying. But I think by the end, I'd grown attached to the characters. They felt inconsistent at times. Sometimes Eddie Bear and Jack were really clever, sometimes they were thick as two shot planks, and sometimes one was smart while the other was dumb, and vice versa. Jack particularly felt like a much cooler character in the first chapter than he did the rest of the book, only really becoming that again in the climax. But that climax was really good, and I think the twists and turns it took were really fun. So yeah, this book was weird and I wasn't always sold on it, but in general I would say I enjoyed it. I have a great love for obscure and underappreciated Nintendo games. Nintendo is such a deep well of content, and some of it is stuff that almost no one has heard of. Another Code is certainly not one of the most obscure things Nintendo has released, but I think it's fair to say it wasn't on anyone's radar as a game they would decide to remake for the Switch. Yet, here we are. So naturally I had to give it a try. It actually took me a few times to get into it. I love story-based games, but I have to have the right conditions to play them in. But I persevered with Another Code 2 Memories, and once I was into it, I enjoyed what I played and I liked the vibe. I don't know how to explain it, but it genuinely did give me mid-2000s DS vibes. It was nice. I think the biggest issue was that I was expecting a slightly different kind of game. Sure, I knew it was going to be story-based, but I was expecting a lot more puzzles. There are puzzles, but the proper puzzles seem to be too few and far between, and many of them are far too telegraphed by the game. There's a few times when things only become interactive when you actually need to use them, which feels far too much like it's trying to railroad you into the correct answers, and then sometimes the actual interactivity of things changes when you progress other things, but not in a good way. For example, I can interact with a desk and it just tells me that it's a desk, and then only later when I am told I need to open a certain door does it let me actually explore the desk. This can make it feel way too obvious where I'm supposed to look. But another effect of this is that I sometimes won't go back to the desk because I assume it's not interactive, because it didn't let me interact with it before. This makes some puzzles so much harder than they need to be. It feels like the game wants you to do things in a very specific order, and therefore it takes away a lot of your agency, which isn't a good thing in an exploration-based puzzle game. So maybe viewing it as a puzzle game isn't the right way to look at it, and as an interactive story it fares a lot better. There are intriguing mysteries, and I found myself very interested in piecing together what was going on. I will say though that I was much more invested in Ashley's story than Dee's. I'm not even entirely sure why, as Dee's should have been interesting too, but maybe the fact that the mystery in Ashley's story was happening in the present made it feel more tangible. It also didn't really feel like the two stories were connected, which wasn't necessarily a deal breaker, but I was always waiting to figure out why these two stories were brought together and why they were on this island, and the only connection they gave kind of felt weak. So overall, I found a lot of unsatisfying elements to this game, but I did still enjoy it, and I'm really glad Nintendo decided to give this game a second life on the Switch. I feel like saying that I don't get the hype behind Dune would risk me getting myself into some hot water, but yeah, I just don't get the hype. I mean, it was fine. The actual sci-fi world introduced and explored was very interesting, but that's about all that I really took from it. The tech was cool, the sandworms were cool, but I kept waiting to find a reason to be invested in the characters, and it simply never came. And that's not to say they were bad characters, not at all, but I felt like the film was so focused on trying to best represent the physical and political aspects of the world, as well as a heavy dose of symbolism, and they didn't leave much time for the actual characters to get developed. Most of the things they did were in relation to the other aspects of the film, which was fine, but I just needed more. I don't even have much more to say. I watched the film, it was alright, but not one I'll ever return to, and I have no interest in the sequel. Philip Reeve has always been one of my favourite authors. He's written so many books that I've loved, but especially the Mortal Engines, Larklight and Railhead series. These are books that engrossed me as a kid, and as a young adult too, and when Railhead was releasing, I couldn't wait for the next book to come out. But when I stopped reading as much, I kinda lost track of what Philip Reeve was doing. So imagine my delight when, on a whim, I decided to look him up to see if he had anything out that would be worth taking on for this challenge, and lo and behold, he has an entire new trilogy out, Utterly Dark. I ordered the first book immediately and started reading it as soon as I finished the Hollow Chocolate Bunnies of the Apocalypse. If I'm honest, Utterly Dark is unlikely to become a favourite of mine, at least not based on the first book, but I enjoyed it enough to want to read the rest of the trilogy at some point. I feel like I do prefer Reeve's sci-fi offerings. Utterly Dark felt like a much slower burn. Most of his other books feel like a lot more is happening throughout, and Utterly Dark feels like it meanders a bit. And then all of a sudden stuff starts happening with about 100 pages to go, and it just feels a bit unbalanced. I think the slow burn would have worked a lot better if it was building towards unravelling a more complex mystery, but there aren't really many twists that can't be pieced together from pretty early on, and it feels like it tries to put off revealing things a bit too long, and by that point, any tension or suspense has kinda dissipated. I also feel like the book just didn't have a really killer moment like there have been in Reeves' past works. Mortal Engines and Railhead specifically captivated me not simply on their unique concepts, but also because each of them had a moment that hit me really hard and made me emotional. This book doesn't have anything like that. Not that it doesn't have nice character moments, but nothing that truly made my heart sink into my boots or made me really feel a character's pain. I think maybe my issue here is that I'm coming back to an author I've always held in very high esteem, and maybe I'm just much more critical of things in general now. I should try to judge this book on its own merit, but that's difficult for me to do. With that said, I didn't have a bad time with it, and I do hope to read the rest of the series at some point. Hey, maybe the sequels will let me truly fall in love with the island of Wildsea and the characters that inhabit it. I knew Gravity Falls was good, obviously. As well as having seen bits and bobs in the past, I've always been aware of how many people love it, so I knew I was in for a treat. And yeah, that's what I got. The series is only 2 seasons, which I didn't realise, but that feels perfect as it doesn't feel like it's overstretching itself, nor does it feel like it got cut short. It feels like it did everything that it needed to do. The show has a similar quality to it that I would say something like Phineas and Ferb has. Obviously they're kids shows, but they also don't stop themselves from making jokes that might fly over a kid's head as long as it's funny, which this show absolutely is. Every episode is creative, even when they use very similar concepts, and I don't think that there was a single episode I didn't really enjoy. I really enjoyed that Mabel and Dipper have a very close, loving relationship, without really any animosity or rivalry, not at first anyway. I do feel like in the first season, Dipper is very clearly the main character, and Mabel takes a more supporting role for most of the episodes of that season, although season 2 really spreads it quite equally between them. And, of course, Bill Cipher is an excellent villain. A true wildcard who can be utilised in such fun, creative ways. He is unhinged in the best possible way, and he's one of the most charismatic characters in the show. And the final stretch of episodes, focusing on the characters trying to take him down, turn this fun villain of the week type show into an epic story about defeating a truly eldritch horror. There are so many amazing things about this show, more than I can talk about here. I've seen some awesome cartoons in my time, and this certainly belongs among them. So at this point in the year, I was in March, and I had read 3 books. In order to be on target, I would have to be at 6 books by the end of the month. I wasn't going to make that at my current pace, so I decided to read a shorter book. And fortunately for me, I had a bunch of Michael Morpurgo books lying around, and some of them I hadn't read. Some of these were very short, so I decided to read Billy the Kid. I've read a fair few of these in my time, and one of them, Cool, is the only book that has ever made me cry. Although mainly because a dog called Lucky dies in that, and I had a dog called Lucky at the time. Billy the Kid was one I hadn't read before, but I'd always known about it. And honestly, these books feel like they are designed to affect the human brain in the most effective ways possible. It feels almost transparent how they're trying to use topics like death and war to tell a sad, yet ultimately heartwarming story. That's just Michael Morpurgo's style, but it's effective and honestly it works. There's also something weird about this one specifically. I'm not sure if this is something his other books do, or whether it's a quirk of this book and maybe an attempt to make the story more digestible to younger readers, but the narration doesn't feel like it has any presence in the actual scenes. As in, the scenes themselves aren't actually described in much detail, just very basic overviews of what happened and how Billy himself is feeling. It does feel very much like an old man recounting his life, and that kind of works for what it's trying to do, but it also feels a bit weird to me. At the end of the day, I didn't expect to be super into Billy the Kid, but it was a pleasant enough read and a good way to get caught up a little in this challenge. It does feel weird that I haven't been super into any of the books I've read in this challenge so far. Would be nice to find one I genuinely fall in love with, but we shall have to see. If you don't know about it, this game is based around those games you see ads for all the time on YouTube that look like fun little time wasters but end up just not being what the games actually are if you ever decided to download them. Yeah, you want those games right, so here you go, now let's see you clear them, seeks to take some of those concepts and make a game based around them. It's a really fun idea, and it got a fair bit of attention when it released. I personally downloaded it then, and played a bit of it, and had a good time with it, but I didn't finish most of the games in it. I decided to use it as a game that I can watch when I'm trying to watch TV, but not TV that I want to be fully focused on. I would often use Suikoden or Picross for this, but I decided to give this game another go. The game has 5 separate mini-games within it, and they vary in how good they are. Colour Lab is a game where you have test tubes full of different coloured liquids, and you have to get all of the colours to be separate. Kind of like a variation of Towers of Hanoi. This was fine, but uninteresting, and I'm fairly sure there are versions of this that actually exist, so it was also the least novel. Parking Lot is similar, as I'm fairly sure this kind of thing exists, but it's far less common and I had a more enjoyable time with it. Then there's Number Tower. In this one, you have a number assigned to you, which you can increase or decrease by taking potions and weapons, or defeating enemies. Potions and weapons tell you the calculations they're applying, which can be adding, dividing, multiplying, or subtracting. And you have to prioritise the order of these operations to make the number big enough to kill the enemies. I had some fun trying to apply my math skills to it, but the actual animations made the whole thing so slow, and if I had to restart a level multiple times, it became a massive pain. It was because of that I decided to use a guide for a couple of levels, which is always disappointing. My personal favourite game was Cash Run. You have to pick up money as you walk along, and you can use this to make a platform to get to higher levels or avoid obstacles. You can also go through gates which give you choices that can either wipe out your money or give you a massive amount more. At the end of each level, you get a different house based on how much money you made, and this was really satisfying. This is the game that I actually fully completed when I first played the game, as I enjoyed it so much. Finally, there's Pinball. And this is probably overall the best of the games. It's based on those ads you see where you have to pull pins to open up the pathways between your character and some treasure, but making sure not to run into enemies or destroy the treasure. This makes for some really clever, fun puzzling that never gets boring. It also has the most levels, 200, but it never feels like it outstays its welcome. As a whole, this is a fun idea, which has some great fun types of game and acts as a fun way to poke fun at some of the stupider sides of the industry. I will say I was hoping for more types of games than this, as there are some really interesting game types in these ads that could be a lot of fun. I'd love to see some DLC, honestly. What the heck was that? But, like, in a good way? I'd heard that Neon Genesis Evangelion's ending, particularly the last 2 episodes, were really controversial, although I didn't know how. But I figured it out pretty quickly as I went into them. The abstract nature of it is super weird, and I didn't get it at first. I did have a hunch as to what was happening, and a tiny bit of research after finishing it confirmed my suspicions. And I guess it's sticking with me, and I don't know how to feel about it, but it felt like an experience. I didn't know what to think of the show at first, mostly because it had a very oppressive atmosphere and felt kind of dreary other than the incredibly intense action. And just when I was starting to get used to that and really appreciate it, it turned into a villain of the week Saturday morning cartoon, and I enjoyed that. And then it started to take a much darker turn again, a much more introspective turn, until breaking down entirely into something strange and abstract. And honestly, I think that journey itself reinforces how strong the experience is. It isn't one of my favourite anime, but I get why it's so popular. I also get why its ending is so controversial, but I actually think it's kind of perfect that way. I didn't entirely get it, but I don't even know if the words being spoken and the images being shown specifically are the point. Being able to follow Shinji through the depths of his introspection and near dive into madness and then seeing him come out the other side was actually very satisfying. The only massive issue I had with this show was that there's a bit too much emphasis on nudity, not exactly shown but still implied, the issue being that many of the characters that are subject to this are children, but hey, I can see how there might have been some symbolism in that. I like jazz. This has become a bit of a joke in my family, as they do not like jazz. But while I wouldn't say that I'm a hardcore jazz fan by any stretch of the imagination, I find it an incredibly enjoyable genre of music, full of energy and personality and, well, I don't know how else to explain it other than momentum. I also love films that are about or partially about jazz, such as La La Land, which is one of my favourite films. Whiplash is also a film about jazz, but it feels to me less about that than it is about the human spirit. I remember a friend of mine who is basically the most knowledgeable person I know when it comes to music, telling me she hates the film because she feels it misrepresents the music industry at the top level, but I don't think it's necessarily meant to be about that. It's about two men's egos and how those egos clash and eventually come together to achieve something extraordinary. It isn't a story that has to be about music, and yet it's one that is perfect when paired with music. Half the fun of this film is seeing J.K. Simmons throwing the most vitriolic, satisfying insults at people. Because let's be honest, J.K. Simmons is a treasure, and this feels like the kind of role he was born to play. Although frankly, I think you can say that about any of his roles, and that's what makes him so good. But the last scene of the film, where Fletcher gets one over on Neiman and essentially tries to screw his career in the most thorough way possible, is the perfect kind of gut punch, only elevated when Neiman comes back on stage and kills it with a performance so good Fletcher comes along on the ride. That whole scene, and it is a long one, full of a lot of drumming, is an experience. It is just pure intensity, and frankly, despite only having watched that scene half an hour ago as of writing, I just want to watch it again. I get why this film gets a lot of love. I want to reiterate one of the rules I set at the beginning of this challenge. I have to choose media that is not in the same franchise as another piece of media in this challenge. However, reading multiple books by the same author is allowed, hence why I'm able to read No Such Thing as Dragons, another Philip Reeve book. Just wanted to clear that up. This is my favourite book so far this year. It has a very interesting concept. A con artist who tells foolish people that he can slay dragons is forced to face off against an actual dragon, or what appears to be one. I found the setting and the atmosphere incredibly gripping, and I quite like the idea of a mute protagonist, although I do feel like staying entirely in his perspective may have been more beneficial to the book, instead of drifting towards other characters for short spells. None of the sections where they did that really added enough to warrant it. I do really love the actual dragon and how it's presented. It has some resemblance to a dragon, but has feathers and doesn't breathe fire, plus it's a biped. It feels like what they're actually faced up against is a dinosaur, and I think that's really cool. I found the book very tense, and I was gripped the whole way through. This is the kind of thing I wanted in a Philip Reeve novel. Blockbuster is, put simply, not very funny. I had a little hope for it, seeing as it seemed like it could be similar to other comedies I've enjoyed, Superstore being chief among them. Sure, I hadn't heard much about Blockbuster, but the same was true of Superstore, and yet I'd loved that one. So maybe Blockbuster would be the same, a hidden gem that I would end up really enjoying. No, it was not. The concept is interesting, focusing on the last Blockbuster store in existence and the people trying to keep it alive when corporate folds. It's best not to think too hard about the massive issues this brings up. The thing is, while interesting in concept, the biggest effect this has is making 95% of the humour focused entirely on pop culture. That itself can work, but the issue is that the actual jokes feel so predictably set up and delivered, and very forced. And I don't know, they just aren't funny. That's all it really comes down to. The cast of characters is nothing to write home about either. None of them feels really unique or interesting, as they're mostly just mouthpieces for the pop culture references. I also find it weird that Percy and Kayla are straight up not in 2 of the episodes. Every other main cast member is in every episode. It's just these guys for some reason. Not that I'm unhappy about it, as they are the most unlikable characters. I also feel like the main arc, Timmy and Eliza's fluctuating feelings for each other, is both incredibly uninspired and also handled in the most underwhelming way possible, seeming to tease a cliffhanger at the end of the season which ultimately has no tension, because not only do we know that both have feelings for each other now, but they are both single too, so there's no real cliffhanger. Suffice it to say, I was not at all disappointed that this was not reviewed for another season, and nothing of worse has been lost for that fact. My media challenge is not the only challenge I've set myself this year. I'm a little bit very overweight, and so my main goal this year has been to lose weight. This has been a goal of mine for years, but this year has actually seemed to bear fruits in that regard. One of the ways I'm motivating myself is by using video games. Every weight milestone I hit, which is every stone I lose, I'll buy myself a video game as a reward. These are games I have an interest in, but would not necessarily buy otherwise. The first of these milestone games was Cult of the Lamb, and the second was Disney Illusion Island. I'd been interested in this from its appearance in a Nintendo Direct, but when it released I had seen people saying it wasn't really all that amazing. But still, I liked the art style and I wanted to give it a shot. In the end, I loved it. I'd expected it to be a standard platformer, so I was actually a little shocked when I found out that it's more like a Metroidvania, featuring one massive world that opens up more when you get new abilities. I don't really tend to be that into Metroidvanias, but this deviated in a few ways. Firstly, there's no combat. Many Metroidvanias give you the ability to fight your opponents, but this game doesn't. That means it has a much greater emphasis on pure platforming, which Metroidvanias don't tend to have, and as a result it appeals to me much more. It also feels kinda linear in terms of how you progress, with revisiting previous areas only really a means to either get to new areas or explore for more collectibles. And there are a lot of collectibles. I think there are 5 different types of collectibles, and it makes it feel packed with stuff to find. One criticism I've heard of the game, and yeah, I kind of agree, is that it's fairly easy. But with that said, there's a difficulty option, which means you can either have 1, 2 or 3 hearts at the start of the game. This helped a bit with the challenge, although it started off fairly easy still, but despite gaining more hearts as the game goes on, it did actually get quite difficult thanks to some pretty tricky enemy types, especially in the water area. I can see how this would be an excellent game for kids, a perfect introduction to Metroidvanias for any kid, but I think there's a lot to appreciate as is. It has a wonderful visual style, sometimes a little busy, but I genuinely think it was quite beautiful, and the animations for the characters and enemies in this game were wonderful. I mean, it's made by Disney, go figure. It also feels really good to play, with the controls and movement feeling really satisfying, and the additional moves you get through the game helping make it feel more acrobatic and fun. I also loved the humour of this game. I believe this is actually based on a Mickey Mouse cartoon that was made a few years back, and it is quite funny at times. I especially loved Donald as a character, and as a result he was the character I played as. I feel like the twist was quite predictable, but it didn't matter so much. I was less into the fact that the final boss was against Mazzy instead of Toku, and Toku was dispatched in hilarious fashion, but it did feel slightly anticlimactic. The boss fights we got were fun though, and this game in general is simply very fun. I'm glad I took a chance on it. Invincible is a tale of two halves. Firstly, I have personal issues with excessive use of gore in shows. I think that certain situations, such as the slaughter of the Guardians of the Globe and Nolan using Mark's face to murder a train full of people, are great ways to hammer home the brutality of those situations. But I feel like Invincible uses excessive gore too often, to the point where it can be somewhat redundant when it's needed. But that is basically the only issue I had with Season 1, and the story it told over the 8 episodes, especially towards its end, was as intriguing as it was tense, and occasionally horrifying. Nolan is an excellent antagonist, and Mark an incredibly relatable protagonist. The cast of characters was interesting, and I loved how the world very much has the same vibe as something like Marvel, where pretty much anything can exist, from robots to aliens to magic. Season 2 felt a little more all over the place. There were various plot threads dangling through the series, and while there is likely a Season 3 on the way, it still felt weird that some of them were just left hanging. The alien Parasyte things were a particular victim of this. That was left dangling from last season, and then they seemed to resolve it this season, only to reveal that it was not indeed resolved. I don't have much investment in that side of things, so it's hard to really care. This may have been a symptom of being an adaptation, but as I haven't read the original comics, I can't really comment on that. Only what I see in the show. I also feel like Angstrom Levy being the main antagonist in the finale was pretty underwhelming, both because the Viltrumite Empire is the much more threatening antagonist, and also because he barely even did anything in the series outside of the first episode. And one of my least favourite parts was Amber. Obviously the handling of her in the first season was heavily criticised, and rightly so, but just pretending like that never happened and switching up her character did not feel like the solution. Honestly, as much as I still had a good time with this season, I never found myself excited to watch it, and season 1 was a lot better. Star Wars is a series of films about a small group of people who fight back against an oppressive regime. Everyone loves that kind of underdog story, but some people have pointed out that, from a certain point of view, the rebels are basically terrorists. The expression "one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter" comes to mind. However, I do feel like one thing about terrorism is sort of lost when you view Star Wars from that angle: the terror bit. Terrorism is, after all, fundamentally about utilising fear as a weapon against a much larger enemy when traditional combat would lead to a loss. At least, that's partially what it's supposed to mean. Wasp is about James Mallory, a human who is selected to go to an alien planet and pose as a citizen of that planet to sow discontent, unease and anger, to destabilise the government and cause them to redirect resources to their own planet, aiming their own guns at themselves as it were, in order to make the war effort on the front line easier. I just thought of it as a fun idea for a sci-fi novel at first, but then I read a quote on the back of the book from Terry Pratchett referring to it as a terrorist handbook. Viewing it from that angle makes an already interesting read even more intriguing. I really enjoyed Wasp. Firstly, the narration was full of humour and energy, which made it a delight. Mallory's inner dialogue was also incredibly intriguing, seeing him weigh up all his options, when he could take risks and when he could not, and how certain unknown factors could derail his plans. The latter end of the book, where everything went quite wrong and he had to use every trick he had up his sleeve, was probably the most tense part of the whole thing, and I was hooked. I basically spent an entire evening reading the last half of it. I love sci-fi novels like this. There's a moment on pages 42 and 43 of Bad Dad where the main character's aunt reads him a poem and waits expectantly to see what he thinks. Two things are clear. She believes this poem to be a masterpiece, excellent, but also the poem is not even slightly. I feel this deluded belief that a work of art is amazing is quite an ironic thing to feature in this book. I can only imagine that as David Walliams wrote this book, he was incredibly happy, feeling he had poured his every passion into it, and this was the result. And he probably believed that it was amazing, and it is not. I was a massive fan of David Walliams' children's novels, but not because I was a child. Indeed, I was actually in my teens when I first encountered them, and yet I still loved them. Partially because I've always had an appreciation for children's media anyway, but also because they were just really good. At least I thought so at the time. They were 2 parts Roald Dahl and 1 part Michael Morpurgo, being fairly fun, silly books, but also having a really strong emotional core. They were grounded, but that didn't mean they couldn't be ridiculous at times. And they often had moments that were beautiful and heartbreaking, and that was the joy of them. I genuinely have to reevaluate whether my memory of The Boy in the Dress, or Billionaire Boy, or The Midnight Gang, or Gangster Granny is accurate, because the more of Bad Dad I read, the more baffled I was by the poor quality. The story felt like an ugly amalgamation of elements of other Walliams books rather than trying to be unique in and of itself. A relative who commits a great robbery, a family so incredibly poor that great detail is put into demonstrating all the things they have to put up with in ridiculous fashion, a mother who runs off to be with a rich man, a wedding in the end of the book. It all feels like I've seen it before. Not just that, but the way the book was written was painful. There was an odd focus on using onomatopoeia at literally every turn, and the dialogue, I don't even know how to explain it, but it was not good. There were some incredibly weird decisions too. Having the mother be truly the worst person imaginable, far beyond the barely implied abuse she has been through, to the point where she was ready to shoot her son's father, and yet she was able to be brought around in a second. There were some kind of weird and uncomfortable moments between the family. The actual plan is just so ridiculously stupid, and letting the dad actually go free felt like it robbed what could have been a kinda okay ending. And then there's the potentially racist Asian stereotype who plays almost no role in the story, only does anything in a single scene where there is no consequences, and feels like he exists solely to have a racist Asian stereotype. The whole thing makes me want to cringe at several points. The one shining light is Raj, a recurring character in all of these books, and if I had any doubt about whether the issues were with this book and not all his other works, then Raj is the thing that would convince me. He is a fun, likeable character with a central gimmick that they always find ways to work into his scenes. The scenes at his shop were a relief. And my guess is that because Walliams has had so much experience writing this character specifically, he knows how to write a good scene with Raj. This makes me feel like the rest of the book is an outlier, and that David Walliams can make incredible children's literature, but maybe due to running out of ideas, or maybe due to it becoming less about making something special and more about making something that sells, he's kind of lost his touch and the will to do better. The most frustrating thing is that I just wish there was a really convenient adjective that I could use to describe this book, but, well, none comes to mind. Parasyte the Maxim is hands down my favourite anime. It has an intriguing concept, but the story it tells is quite beautiful, and I fell in love with it very quickly. It's also the only anime I've ever rewatched in full. So when I was scrolling through Netflix and I saw that something called Parasyte the Grey was coming soon, I couldn't believe my eyes. A live action adaptation of my favourite anime. I know adaptations of anime tend to be very hit or miss, mostly miss, but I couldn't wait to see what this was all about. To call it an adaptation of the anime or the original manga would be to somewhat misrepresent it. This is essentially a different story within the world of Parasyte. It follows, and please pardon my pronunciation of names here, Jeong Soo-in, who is essentially saved by a parasite when it tries to take over her while she's dying, having to heal her and thus not being able to fully take over her brain. This is a neat little twist on the idea, and thankfully not just a rehash of the same idea of Shinichi's hand getting taken over in the manga and anime. It took me no time at all to feel like I loved this show. Firstly, the effects are fantastic. They look pretty much exactly as they did in the anime, with just more detail, and they nailed the body horror that makes the parasites work. The action sequences were also excellent. The parasites having to use their heads as weapons could be very easy to make look awkward, especially in live action, but they managed to make it feel fluid and entertaining every time. The story told here was really solid. Soo-in's backstory felt strong, the way the parasites tried to infiltrate human organisations was great, and overall I enjoyed pretty much every character, and it didn't feel like there were too many characters either. I will say that Heidi doesn't feel like enough of a character for the emotional development she goes through over the course of the series. Only being able to be active for 15 minutes and almost never being able to talk directly to Soo-in was very limiting, and I just don't think there was enough of her. That said, the idea of a human and parasite sharing a body but not being able to talk was a really interesting twist on the idea, and I like the dynamic. But it's hard not to feel this human-parasite relationship just lacks in comparison to Shinichi and Migi. My other big issue isn't even an issue with the show itself, and it's that I struggle a bit with subtitles. I find it hard at times to read fast enough to catch everything, and reading subtitles takes my attention away from what's happening on the screen. I also struggle with being able to match the words being spoken to the specific tone it's being delivered in, as the intonation on each word and syllable is lost when watching with subtitles, and that's a big deal to me. I could watch with the dub instead, but I find that when I do that with live action, it feels uncanny in a way that's distracting in an entirely new way. This isn't an issue for anime, which is why I always watch dubs there. But live action, it doesn't work for. I've heard the dub is insanely good, but I still didn't want to experience the grey that way. Maybe I would have appreciated it even more if this wasn't an issue for me, but as it is, I still absolutely loved the show, and I tell you, I almost cheered out loud on seeing Shinichi in the last scene. I'd love to see this continued. Tiger and Bunny has a pretty interesting concept. On the surface, it seems very similar to the X-Men. In society, there are people who develop superpowers, known as Next, who are shunned and looked down on in society. The big deviation from X-Men is the fact that in order to help people develop a much more positive view of Next, a group of them make up a superhero team which fights crime, and this is broadcast on a TV channel called Hero TV. The whole thing is actually a competition, assigning points to the heroes for making arrests or saving people. In this way, the heroes are ranked. There is one disappointment I have with the show, and that's that they almost never actually touch on the potential moral quandaries this brings up. The first episode seemed like it was going to go this way, when Kotetsu decided to jump into the fray even though Agnes had told him to stop until an ad break had finished. I thought this show was going to end up exploring how a body trying to direct the heroes based on its own selfish intentions, rather than what is best for those in trouble, could potentially lead to very harmful effects, but it never went that way. I think there could have been something really interesting in that, But in the end, Hero TV was just an interesting framing device for a superhero show, and not much deeper than that. I can't be too upset though, because the show is a lot of fun. The characters are very likeable, and outside of the main duo, my favourite has to be Sky High, who I initially thought was going to be a super arrogant jerk, based on the fact that he was said to be top of the rankings, and his general voice and characterization in the first couple of episodes just seemed to suggest that. But he ended up being just a really lovable guy. I also like that they had quite a bit of queer representation that felt really natural to be there, although I wish they hadn't made Fire Emblem grope rock bison a couple of times. It was passed off as a gag, but it felt like it slightly perpetuates a negative stereotype. It's something I can ignore, especially as someone who's not in the LGBTQA+ community myself, but it's just a bit of a weird thing for them to do and then double down on. The 3D animation for the fights also works quite well, even though the first season sometimes tries to put 3D and 2D graphics together in ways that look really off. And the action is great, but the whole thing really rests on the central relationship of Kotetsu and Barnaby. They start out as extremely volatile towards each other, but over time they develop respect for each other, and then a close partnership and friendship. And it feels like it was developed at a very natural pace. The relationships between other characters were also great, especially when the buddy system was introduced in Season 2. And Season 2 in general felt like it made much better use of the supporting cast and their development, instead of just giving each character their own episode and being done with it. Overall, I had a really great time with this one. It somehow didn't occur to me that it took until mid-April for me to watch an animated film, despite animated films being my favourite kind of film on the whole. I mean, I'd seen a couple, but either in the franchise of something I'd already watched, or I watched it with a friend, so it doesn't count. I'd heard some vague positive buzzings about Leo, and the trailer looked good, so I thought I'd give it a try. Leo is about a lizard school pet getting on in his days and wanting to escape so that he can live life a little before he dies. But when he's taken home by students of the class and starts talking to them, he realizes that he actually really loves trying to help them with their troubles. The film is incredibly heartfelt, and seeing every kid's insecurities and how Leo helps them is really sweet. At the same time, it's surprisingly funny. The humour really landed for me when the jokes aren't just slightly juvenile. There were a few poop and pee jokes, but overall it wasn't too intrusive, and most of the humour was great. I enjoyed the character of Miss Malkin especially, and how she ended up softening as the film went on. I also love that there was a turtle called Squirtle. That was a cute little reference. Only thing that slightly turned me off was that the way it was animated felt a little weird at times, like maybe just a bit cheap, but it wasn't a big deal, and the rest of the film made up for it. It was just delightful. I've always enjoyed the Jurassic World films. I know they get a bad rap for a variety of reasons, but I think dinosaurs are cool, and damn it if these films don't make dinosaurs feel even cooler. So I can tend to look past weird plot points or an abundance of CGI to just appreciate putting dinosaurs in a variety of situations and seeing the humans have to survive whatever is thrown at them. And I don't need to compare them to the Jurassic Park movies because I haven't seen them. I told you, I haven't seen movies. Okay, I have seen some of Jurassic Park, but never the whole thing the whole way through. You may be wondering why I chose to watch Dominion for this challenge rather than Jurassic Park itself. Well, I've seen the other two Jurassic World films, so I'm somewhat invested, and it popped up on Netflix, so I thought I might as well give it a watch. And I actually enjoyed it more than most people, I think. Overall, it satisfied my dino itch, and there were a lot of cool dinosaur moments and unique uses of different types of dinosaur, which I had a great time with. The idea of humans having to just deal with dinosaurs being a thing in the real world now was great, and also added a lot of unique scenarios. That doesn't mean I don't have criticisms. The dialogue at times was very off, although not enough to be distracting to me most of the time. The locusts being burned and somehow surviving long enough to break out of their containment and fly for quite a while felt quite unbelievable and a very forced way to create some urgency. Also, as iconic as the T-Rex is, it's kinda tiring to constantly try and drag it out every time to face off with and defeat something that is definitely more powerful than it. And it feels at some point they're gonna have to just kill it off if we get any more films in this franchise, which, let's be honest, is inevitable. Overall, this is not a film I love, but I had a good enough time with it, and that's all I ever really asked for. I watched Suits years ago. I don't know what made me want to watch it, but I gave it a try and spent months binging it, between other shows of course, but I never actually finished it. I watched the first 7 seasons and then lost interest, and anyone who's seen it knows why. 2 prominent characters, Rachel and Mike, both left at the end of that season, and new characters were brought in to fill the void. And I honestly just didn't care to try and continue on with a show when it had lost half of its initial main cast. But this challenge requires me to clear out some of my backlog, and so I decided that this was finally the time to go back and finish the last 2 seasons. I think leaving it this long actually helped my enjoyment of the last 2 seasons. It's been so long that my memories of the show are not perfect, and that also means that I'm not comparing what it was to what it became. I can learn to appreciate these characters for what they are, and while I still prefer the early cast, I really like the new main cast that came into season 8. The show itself has a fun humour, which helps make all the legal jargon much easier for me to deal with, but I also did enjoy seeing all the legal stuff, and it never felt like they were rehashing things, and I always felt interested in what was going on, especially with how it affected the relationships between the characters. Donna was a fantastic character, and Lewis was incredibly lovable somehow. Harvey had the right blend of arrogance and charm that worked perfectly, but his relationship with Mike was especially fun and really sold a lot of the earlier seasons. Seeing Mike return for a few episodes of the last season was fantastic and reminded me how much I'd enjoyed his character and how he interacted with Harvey. I'm glad I got to return to this show and finally finish it. Having read a book earlier in the year that reminded me heavily of the style of Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, but not quite as elegantly executed, it was inevitable that I would end up revisiting the series for this challenge, sooner rather than later. I've previously read The Colour of Magic, The Light Fantastic and Equal Rights, as well as The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents before I knew what Discworld even was. While I wasn't particularly interested in Equal Rights, I've enjoyed all the others and so I had high hopes for Mort. Hopes it absolutely lived up to. Pratchett's style is full of undeniable wit. I rarely laugh out loud at books, even really funny ones, but Mort had several moments that pushed me to that point. At the same time, the Discworld is an incredibly interesting world, with a set of rules that feel mostly very consistently applied, and it's all so much fun. As for this book specifically, it focuses on Death recruiting an apprentice to follow in his footsteps, and as well as expanding on the lore surrounding him, it also makes an incredibly interesting story that unwinds in a very satisfying way. If I could have one criticism, it's that I personally find sometimes that Pratchett's writing style can get a bit confusing, and sometimes I'll completely miss something that's happened because it was suggested in terms just vague enough that I didn't pick up on it. This is actually an issue I had with The Colour of Magic, but by The Light Fantastic it was no longer an issue, and I assumed that it was just a quirk of The Colour of Magic being the first book in the series. It isn't as bad here as that book, not by a long shot, but it is worth noting. Otherwise, I can't recommend Mort enough. It is a lot of fun, and it has reignited my interest in continuing to read the rest of the series when I have time. Rhythm Paradise on DS has always been a game I've loved. I enjoy rhythm games, but games like Guitar Hero or Voez just lack something for me. Rhythm Paradise gives the answer as to what that lacking is: personality. The games try to concoct the wackiest scenarios possible and then build a rhythm-based game out of that, and it's awesome. I also love the fact that Rhythm Paradise doesn't have the same sort of visual indicators as other rhythm games do. Rhythm Paradise has visual indicators, but they're more there for the context of the game rather than what you're meant to focus on for your timing. The beauty of Rhythm Paradise is that it allows the visuals on screen to literally just be there for entertainment, and in order to master the timing, you need to use your ears and listen for the audio cues. This is what sets it apart from other rhythm games and makes it so enjoyable. The Wii version is only the second Rhythm Paradise game I've played, but it is absolutely the best. While I love the DS version, the controls involving tapping on the DS's touchscreen and sometimes having to swipe on the screen could be kind of tricky to time correctly, especially in the faster games. Beat the Beat instead assigns A and B as the only buttons you will use. You will either be pressing A or A and B together, and that's it. The controls are so incredibly simple and they work perfectly. Most of the other things I love about this game are things it shares with DS. I love that while there is an art style that is predominantly used, there are plenty of games that break from it and it's always a visual delight. The creativity is on top form as well, and I would even say it could be a step up from the DS game, with so many fascinating and hilarious scenarios, some of my favourites being an interview with a wrestler and badminton between a cat and a dog in planes. The soundtrack is incredibly important in a rhythm game, and it is right on form here, although I would say that this is one area I do prefer the DS version, and it just has more tracks I absolutely fell in love with. That said, Remix 3 was stuck in my head for days, so the music is still really strong here. My only real criticisms are that sometimes what was required for the ranking seemed very inconsistent, and I also felt like there were too many games that required you to be constantly pressing A to a beat, but these are really small complaints. Beat the Beat shows just how good Rhythm Paradise can be, and I hope that another game in the series comes to us soon. Gordon Comstock is quite possibly the most insufferable fictional character I've ever had the displeasure of experiencing. He's incredibly selfish, trying to stick to a pointless principle that only ends up causing distress and worse to those that care for him. Almost every single decision he makes is because of money, which would be fairly respectable if it had actually been that he was trying to get money, but no. He goes out of his way to snub any attempt to help him get into a better monetary situation, deliberately. And then he has the gall to blame every problem he has on the existence of money, even things like his girlfriend not wanting to sleep with him. It drove me mad. Okay, let me back up. I've read 2 George Orwell novels in the past, and yes, it's exactly the 2 you're thinking of. 1984 and Animal Farm. Both novels I genuinely loved, but also knew that these are by far Orwell's most notable works, so reading anything beyond that was surprisingly not that much of a priority for me. But I had this one on my shelf, so hey, why not? Keep the Aspidistra Flying is about Gordon Comstock, a would-be poet who has waged a war against money. He quits his good job to have a job on a lower wage with less prospects because that, he believes, is a better way to live. To be away from the money world, to not be at its mercy, is somehow more honourable. Yeah, I don't get it either. And I think that's largely meant to be the point. Gordon does some really stupid and quite terrible things in order to maintain this life for himself, and it's never painted in a positive light. Even though Gordon is an absolute prat and not a very pleasant character to be around, the novel itself held my attention very well, especially as I got deeper into it. It was quite fascinating really, and Orwell is not as iconic as he is for no reason. His narration never got boring. And it was kind of fun rooting against Gordon too, honestly. At the same time, when he finally snaps out of it in the last few pages, it is a kind of nice feeling. At this moment, Gordon feels a feeling he didn't expect, and at first he thinks it might be sorrow or anger, but he realises it's relief at no longer having to live in such conditions as he subjected himself. And as a reader, I thought I'd feel a little cheated at seeing this complete nincompoop get a happy ending after all. But I don't know, I guess seeing him soften as he realises he's having a child kinda got me. After the other 2 Orwell novels, a happy ending wasn't what I was expecting, but I can't say it was unwelcome. The book was a bit frustrating at times, but that seemed to be entirely by design, and I definitely don't regret reading it. This year has been a heck of a year for me personally in terms of 3D platformers. I found out about Lunistice, and Penny's Big Breakaway was released, and then there was Celeste 64 and the Super Kiwi 64 DLC, and Tori Saturn seemingly on the horizon. It's been insane. So hearing that another game I love, Dadish, was getting a 3D version was just the best. Dadish was a game that I played close to when it released, and I had a great time with it. As a platformer, it's very basic, with Dadish's movement literally just moving left and right and having a double jump, but it was very solid, and the best part about it was that once you get to the end of every level, you get an interaction between Dadish and one of his children, and these are very charming and funny. I played it at a very similar time to Tori 3D, but while Tori is a game I returned to over and over again, and grew more and more fond of, and become as enamoured with the following games and other games by Piczle, my feelings towards Dadish faded slightly over time. I still think it's great, but it fell further and further down my top 100 list, and the sequels I thought were just okay. Alright, that's a lie. They're just as good as the original. The issue is that they felt very similar. Solid but basic gameplay that mostly holds interest based on its fun concept, charm and humour. but it's a lot less novel the second and third times round. So that brings us to Dadish 3D, finally evolving Dadish somewhat by introducing the third dimension. I had a lot of hope for it, and I enjoyed it, but it has the exact same issue as Dadish 2 and Dadish 3. Even with it being in 3D, it still feels very basic, and I can't help but feel a bit disappointed in that. It is so incredibly faithful to the original game, just in 3D, and that in itself is commendable, but I find myself just wanting more from it. And you know what? Simple gameplay can be good, but I think I'm finally realising that what Dadish gets wrong is that the gameplay is difficult and at times a bit frustrating, and doesn't give enough respite between those moments, nor is the core gameplay satisfying enough to carry it. I died way more in Lunistice, Penny's Big Breakaway and Celeste 64, but those games have very satisfying mechanics, whether it be Hannah's spin that acts like a triple jump, Penny's momentum on the ground and acrobatic ability in the air, or Madeline's mid-air dash and different advanced techniques. These make movement in the games really fun, so even when you hit a hard bit, it doesn't feel so frustrating to play. Dadish, by comparison, moves very slowly and only has that double jump, and that can feel very frustrating at times. Many of the levels also feel way too long and tedious for the fact that they don't have any checkpoints. I'd often get far through a level, die, and then dread that I still had to do that all over again. In addition, I hated the Burgurgler levels, especially the one in World 3. Burgurgler takes away your double jump and makes the level an auto runner, basically worsening and simplifying an already basic moveset. They weren't fun in Dadish 2 either, as I recall, so I don't know why they were brought back here. But with all that said, I still had a good time with Dadish 3D. I didn't love it, but even with the frustrations, it's still a very solid platformer, and its humour and personality is still here and makes the whole thing worth it. I just think at this point I'm waiting for Dadish to do something fresh. A weird feeling came over me as I turned my 3DS off after having finished Professor Layton and the Azran Legacy. The Layton games are some of the most important video games in my life, having fundamentally altered parts of my personality, so finally completing the last game in the prequel series should have felt triumphant. It's taken me over a decade to complete these 3 games, and I realised that once I turned it off, I'd never boot that game up again. Now, that isn't to say it's a bad game, not even slightly. It's everything you expect from a Layton adventure, but the original trilogy was insanely good, and it feels like they've severely struggled to capture the same magic with the prequels. Why is that? Maybe the fact that characters like Chelmy, Flora and Don Paolo were either absent or in the background, with their replacements just not being as interesting. Maybe it's the fact that a series that could already get pretty ridiculous with its sci-fi became straight up fantasy as the prequels went along. As soon as I saw the giant manatee thing in the Spectre's Call, I knew that these games would be a lot more different to the first games. There are many reasons that the prequels just feel lesser than the original trilogy. Sure, they have great puzzles and an interesting enough story, but the originals had that in spades too and easily outdid the prequels. Azran Legacy has some of the clearest demonstrations of the issues. They tried way too hard to make use of the 3D screen for a start, making the controls for some puzzles much more awkward than they needed to be. There also seemed to be a lot of variations of ice floor puzzles as well as general maze style puzzles, which aren't necessarily bad types of puzzles, but usually are better in moderation, and the fact that there's so many, even with their own distinctions, feels like it hampers variety. I also feel like the exploration side of the game kinda sucks. Sure, being able to travel to 9 different locations with different biomes and cultures is fun, but most of these places are very small and don't feel fleshed out at all. One of the reasons I think Curious Village may be the best one is that it gives you one location that you explore and uncover its secrets gradually. A globetrotting adventure is fun, but it comes at the cost of making the whole thing feel much less cohesive, and the overarching story takes a back seat most of the time. And the story, particularly at the end, is just weird. I get that they want to raise personal stakes, but Descalé being Layton's brother and Bronev his father just kinda came out of nowhere, as does the Emmy betrayal, although I was spoiled of that a couple of months ago. It's still Layton at the end of the day, but I would be lying if I said that I had a great time with it. I mostly wanted to finish this before New World of Steam releases, and I hope that game addresses some of my issues with this game and the prequels in general. It occurred to me that, despite the fact that I'm British, I haven't actually watched any British TV shows for this challenge. That isn't to say I haven't experienced any British media through the challenge. In fact, most of the books I've read have been British. But for TV, despite there being plenty of British TV I could watch, I just haven't sought any out yet. That might be because I'm much more likely to watch British TV with my family, but I decided that this was the time that I should try out something from our own little island, and I wanted it to be something significant. Enter Life on Mars. I've watched the first episode before, but I haven't watched past that. That said, I like detective shows, and I remember this being a massive deal way back when it was first out. I was very young at the time, so I obviously didn't watch it, but I had certainly heard of it, and I get why it was so popular. Other than having a lot of stuff that makes detective shows good anyway, the central hook of Sam Tyler being in an accident and waking up in 1973 is a very intriguing concept, and seeing him try to get used to the policing 30 years in the past is pretty fun. It also has a great central mystery to it. What has actually happened? Is he in a coma, or is there something more to it? I don't really feel like the answer was all that interesting, as it just seems like he was in a coma. A really good one, but just a coma, and him going back into the coma feels like it was a necessary way for the show to go, but they didn't really set it up enough. Sam is constantly making it clear that he doesn't really like being in 1973, and while he has lost some of the things he had in his real life, such as his girlfriend, not enough was shown of him being unhappy with his life in the modern world before, like, the last 10 minutes of the show. On a more positive note, one of the most fascinating parts of the show to me is its most iconic character, Gene Hunt. He's a character type you don't see anymore, a quite bigoted character with a lot of prejudices, who nonetheless does what he does for very positive reasons. Is it too much to say he's ultimately a good person? Maybe, but his bigotry somehow doesn't make him any harder to root for. They captured the right balance of making him entertaining enough while also showing that making the city safe for everyone is his main priority, which makes up for his significant shortcomings. I doubt a character like this could exist these days in something so mainstream, so Life on Mars is something of a time capsule. I wouldn't say Life on Mars is spectacular, but it was certainly very good. I'd heard very mixed things about Bullet Train. Some people seem to really love it, but others considered it a massive disappointment, or just generally nothing to write home about. After watching it, I actually went to look at what the Rotten Tomatoes score was, and 54%? Really? I have to question whether I was watching the same movie, because Bullet Train was awesome. It generally follows a variety of characters all on a bullet train. Their reasons for being there intertwined, but generally it seems to revolve around a briefcase with a Thomas the Tank Engine sticker on it. I found this film to be a lot of fun. It has a lot of energy, despite being set on a single train, but most of the characters have very different designs and vibes. The action is great, the characters are fun and all stand out in their own ways. The comedy is excellent, the plot unravels in a very satisfying fashion. What's not to love? Seriously, I had a blast the whole way through, and I don't quite understand where the negative reviews come from. The one criticism I see that I really get is the whitewashing of the cast, and yeah, that's fair. The whitewashing isn't something that bothers me on a personal level, but finding out that the film is an adaptation and that a lot of the characters were changed from Japanese people to mostly American celebrities, yeah, that kinda sucks. I'm a bit of a purist when it comes to adaptations, and I've always felt like keeping as loyal as possible is better when adapting something. But I will say that in this case, it had some benefits. It did make the cast feel more diverse in a way, especially given there were characters from many different countries, making it a much more international affair. I also think the gag of a celebrity actor basically being a very short cameo for a flashback or just before getting killed was pretty fun. So I don't mind it personally, but I wouldn't exactly argue with someone who said that it was a net negative change to make. Otherwise though, really great time. Would recommend to anyone who just wants a fun action film. Talking about tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow in a full yet succinct manner may well be impossible. I have no idea how I'm going to do this, so my plan is to just start writing and see what happens. And if it ends up being a 10-minute section of this video, then so be it, because I need to talk about this book. My favourite game of all time, as I've mentioned before, is Celeste. It has been for years now. My favourite TV show of all time is BoJack Horseman, and has had a similarly long run in that tenure. For books and films, it's always been a bit different. There are 3 films that I currently tout as my favourite: WALL-E, La La Land and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, but I can't say what my absolute favourite is. And with books, I've been out of reading for so long that the last book I considered a favourite was The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, a book I still adore, but which I adore even more now as a play. I assumed that the status quo of my favourites would remain unchanged as a result of this challenge. I was not expecting to find my new favourite in any given medium this year. It just seemed unlikely, and possibly just a knee-jerk reaction out of a desire to find something special as a result of this challenge. Let me state it in no uncertain terms. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is my favourite book of all time. I know that with utmost certainty. Nothing else even comes close. But it's not just that it's my favourite. I have a belief that it will remain my favourite basically forevermore. This is a similar feeling that I have to Celeste and BoJack. This book affected me on a deep level. It is so special. The book is about Sam and Sadie, two gamers who become childhood best friends over their love of games. When they grow older, they decide to make games together. I'm a very avid gamer, so a book that puts so much energy into making it feel special to gamers was always going to be a hit for me. But that alone would not make it my favourite. It was the characters that got me. Each of the principal cast had something that I heavily related to. Sam feels like the most obvious. He's someone who studied maths at university, but it isn't really his passion. That's video games. Also, the fact that my best friend's name is incredibly close to Sadie helped me feel an even deeper connection to him. However, my attitude to video games and the creative process is much more similar to Sadie's. I see video games as an art form, and Sadie's unwavering commitment to her artistic vision was something that I heavily related to, even if what that meant to her had changed by the end of the book. But it was Marks that I connected with most, a character who puts all the love he can into every person he meets, something I also try to do. In fact, there was one specific quote that really got me. The way to turn an ex-lover into a friend is to never stop loving them. To know that when one phase of a relationship ends, it can transform into something else. It is to acknowledge that love is both a constant and a variable at the same time. I am infamous to those who know me for the fact that I am currently 3 for 3 on staying friends with my exes, so this felt almost like a call out to me. In fact, so much of this book did. But this isn't just some nice happy story about 3 people who make games. In fact, it's the opposite. In the beginning, it seems that the point of the story is to show that Sam and Sadie are destined to be friends and business partners forever. But as things transpire, it becomes obvious that what seemed like it was something beautiful when they were young turns quite toxic as time and creative and personal differences become more pronounced. The friend that recommended the book to me at some point mentioned that she feels the Sam and Sadie relationship could be comparable to the BoJack and Diane relationship in BoJack Horseman, and that feels incredibly apt. I've seen a lot of people in my brief time looking at people's opinion on Reddit saying that they hated the book because of how toxic its main characters are, but to me, that's the point. These are not perfect people. They have flaws, very heavy flaws, but we get to see what goes through both characters' minds, and even though it's easy to disagree with their actions, it's also easy to sympathise with the reasons behind it. This book is truly a rollercoaster. It's never predictable, and I was left stunned at several points, having assumed things would go a certain way, but never really getting it right. It also really makes use of its medium to the fullest. Jumping around the timeline in the first section of the book, splitting chapters into 2 halves, one from Sam's perspective and one from Sadie's perspective, when they were working on a game that involves 2 separate worlds, having one section which is entirely from the perspective of playing in one of the games, and so on. Not only is the story itself incredibly gripping, but the way it's presented to us is so unique and further reinforces the themes and emotions behind it. And on top of all this, what a love letter to video games. A brief look through the acknowledgements shows that some of the details of the timeline of real life games that were released have been fudged a little, mainly to be more thematically strong, but that didn't bother me so much. There were also a couple of moments where things were referred to in slightly odd ways. Mario couldn't ground pound in the original Super Mario Bros, and referring to games like Tekken and Street Fighter as martial arts games instead of fighting games felt a bit off. But you can tell that this was a book that was written by someone who loves games. It couldn't have been made by anyone who didn't. There is so much understanding of the medium and why we love it and why it is so important to us. And like with Whiplash earlier in this video, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow's story isn't inherently about video games, but it absolutely is better for being about video games. There are so many parallels that are drawn that only enhance the story. My favourite one that I picked up on was that the first game Sam and Sadie played together was Super Mario Bros. This isn't just considered the beginning of the Super Mario franchise, but also it can be seen as the beginning of the console era of video games, so it's fitting that it was the start of Sam and Sadie's friendship too. But it goes deeper than that. Super Mario Bros. Is important not just for starting the Mario series, but also for saving the video game industry from the video game crash of the 80s. Rob put the NES onto store shelves when stores were scared to sell games consoles, but Super Mario Bros. Was what got people buying it. Super Mario Bros. Was how the game industry recovered from that crash. And Super Mario Bros. Was also integral to Sam recovering from his own crash. Flawless, absolutely no notes. I could go on for hours about what I love about this book. While I was reading it, I knew that this would end up being my favourite book of all time. It made me cry at several points, and sometimes that was happy tears because I was aware that I was experiencing something special. It's absolutely phenomenal. If you love video games, you would be a fool not to read this book. If you don't love video games, you'd be a fool not to read this book. Basically, just read the damn book. I'm a pretty big Nintendo fan, but I always feel I should put an asterisk on that statement. Most of my interest lies with Mario, Pokémon, Smash and Animal Crossing. That isn't to say there aren't other games by Nintendo I love. ARMS, Rhythm Paradise, Miitopia, Wii Fit and Ring Fit are all games I love, as well as certain games in some other series such as Breath of the Wild and Kirby and the Forgotten Land. But overall, I feel the actual areas of the company's output I have an active interest in are quite limited. I've played a couple of Metroid games before, but rarely much of them. I usually get stuck and can't be bothered to try and find a way through. And seeing as I'm not a particular fan of first-person shooters, Metroid Prime didn't seem like a particularly promising bet for a game I would love. Oh, how wrong I was. I get it. I get why Metroid Prime is so well loved. After the brief opening on the frigate Orpheon, you're plonked down on the planet and basically just have to explore as much as you can, using new equipment to get past certain obstacles as you collect them. I found this whole process incredibly engaging. Coming to a roadblock can be frustrating, but each new piece of equipment brings the excitement of which obstacles it'll open up to you, and even better if the section I can't get past has been closed off for a long time. The world opens up more and more and it's incredibly satisfying. Also, on the remaster specifically, it is absolutely gorgeous. Hard to believe it wasn't made to look like this, honestly. I started playing this last year, but got a bit stuck on the phase on mines, and while definitely not a bad part of the game, it was a bit of a jump in difficulty that put me off playing it until recently. Part of that was just me not realising how effective charge shots are on the trooper pirates, but it was still a very tricky section of the game. But the game never stopped being fun, even when it was difficult. I feel like this could be the start of me truly becoming a Metroid fan because I loved this game so much. I just hope they decide to remaster the other two Prime games before Prime 4 releases in 2036. I decided to watch Scavengers Reign entirely on the basis of a tweet saying, "Go and watch Scavengers Reign," or words to that effect. I didn't watch any trailers and saw no promotional material, only a couple of images from it that I mostly ignored. I don't know why, but I just got the vibe it was worth checking out. Yes, it was. Scavengers Reign is beautiful, quite the experience. It shows 4 people who land on a weird alien planet in escape pods and have to try and stay alive and find a way off the planet. I think what struck me most about Scavengers Reign was how it depicted its flora and fauna. The trick to alien designs in cartoons like this is that if they look too much like creatures in our own planet, they stop feeling alien. There are some that do this in the show, but for the most part they feel so unusual and completely unlike anything we could observe on Earth, while still feeling organic. And the creatures are so unique in their concepts too, and do so many intriguing things. Every new species is a wonder to behold. But I also love the story itself, particularly Ozzy and Levi's sections of the story. Ozzy seemed at first like she was going to be a cold badass, but I loved how gentle and understanding she was of Levi's development in sentience, and wanted to respect them as if they were human. The bond they developed was really sweet, and Levi being torn apart by the Hollow was heartbreaking. Overall, this show was beautiful. Netflix is apparently watching the performance of the show to see if they want to renew it for a second season after HBO Max cancelled it, but it seems like it hasn't done great, so we may never get another season. But what we have here already is amazing. I didn't realise until looking through the films for this challenge that every film so far has been from the last 10 years. I guess going through Netflix gives a more modern biased selection than I expected. Disney Plus, however, has a lot of classics, and one of the ones I was most interested in was Alien. It's regarded as one of the greatest sci-fi and horror films ever, and while the number of horror films I've seen is in the single digits, I love sci-fi and I want to expand into more of the greats. My only exposure to the Alien franchise has been Alien Isolation, and even that has only been watching Let's Plays as I wasn't able to get far in the game myself. My nerves can't handle horror games. It's clear to me why this is so highly considered. I don't have that much experience with horror, but the tension they build with Alien is incredible. You know there are going to be moments that make you jump, but they never quite hit when you think they will. So many moments felt like the prime opportunity, when one of the guys was cooling himself off in dripping water, and the scene kept going and going and going, and it felt like this must be the moment. But it never was. But it winds you up and it winds you up, and then when it happens, it is a release. It really is expertly crafted. If I'm honest, I think I appreciate it more than I love it. Horror isn't really my thing, and I think knowing as much as I do about it anyway decreased the effect it had on me. I can appreciate it, acknowledge what it's doing, but I can't say I really felt it. I also feel like the xenomorph is slightly undermined at times by the effects. For the most part it's fine, but there are moments when it's just a guy in a rubber suit reaching his hand out in a scary way, and it's anything but. With that said, the actual designs are awesome and they do build incredibly well around it. Its presence is felt from the moment it bursts out of John Hurt's chest, despite its actual appearances on screen being very few. Great film, glad I've seen it now. From one sci-fi movie that starts with an A, has 5 letters, has a female protagonist and features decapitated robot heads, to another. Mind you, Atlas is completely different to Alien, a Netflix sci-fi action film from this year about an AI uprising and a woman in a mech suit, played by Jennifer Lopez. I heard about this mostly from people talking about how it was top trending on Netflix, yet no one seemed to care about it, so my expectations were fairly low. It might have been a result of these low expectations that made me enjoy this quite a bit, or maybe it was just that there's plenty of enjoyable stuff here. I think the Smith AI was the highlight. His interactions with Atlas were great because while he has an artificial cadence about the way he speaks, it adds quite well to the sarcasm and sassiness he has. From the moment he arrives in the film, you can feel his personality. He's quite a funny character, and I love how as the film goes on, his voice becomes less robotic and more human. This was hinted at early in the movie with Zoe sounding like a normal, bubbly human, and I was glad that they showed this transition, even if it didn't feel entirely complete. I think the actual backbone of the plot was the weakest area. Harlan's motivation being to save humanity by killing it is an incredibly tired trope, and doesn't make a lick of sense if you put 2 seconds of thought into it. And in fact, the film felt like it could have set up a much stronger plot. With Atlas's general disdain for AI and the fact that they do seem to be sentient beings, it would have made much more sense for Harlan to be trying to fight for the rights of AI. Overall though, I had a pretty great time with Atlas. Is it top of Netflix quality? I don't know, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. This has been on my radar for a while, and I'm fairly sure it released close to Mitchell's vs. the Machines, but the two films, despite seeming similar in that they both feature AI that glitch out, are actually completely different. This isn't a robot uprising story. Ron is glitching out, but he's just trying his best to be Barney's best friend and help him make friends. Everything that the robots do in the film are fueled by what the humans want. I do love how this film shows both sides of the coin. Social media does create a very toxic environment, especially for kids, and it can cause them to develop insecurities, fall out with people, or even become toxic people themselves. But at the same time, Barney himself isn't any better off for not having access to it. In fact, he's incredibly lonely and isolated. Social media can be awful for kids, but not allowing them to have it is not the solution. There has to be a middle ground, and I'm glad the film acknowledges that, even if the solution it has is only realistically a solution in this fictional universe. Ron himself was immediately likable, and his bond with Barney was so sweet. In fact, most of the characters were. The dad really felt like a guy with a heart of gold, but not the tools to be able to give Barney what he needs, though not for lack of trying. And it was heartbreaking seeing him feel he'd failed his son. The grandmother was also hilarious. And even Savannah and Rich. One was a self-absorbed social media addict whose backhanded compliments were more backhand than compliment, and Rich was straight up a bully, yet I completely bought that they would try to help Barney by the end, because they are clearly a product of the fact that their young, impressionable minds have been taken over by the social media landscape the B-bots have crafted, and they are good kids deep down. I do think the main antagonist and the genius inventor were cliched and uncreative characters, but the heart of the story was great, and frankly, that's what matters. I've always had The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on my radar as something I just had to read. It seemed exactly the kind of thing I would love, and it's regarded as a classic, so when I saw it in the bookstore, I decided to pick it up and add it to my list. And I get why everyone is so crazy about it, but I found myself significantly less enamoured with it than everyone else. I'm not even sure why that is. It's witty, creative, funny, it has it all. And yet something about it didn't click with me. I think maybe it was that I was never entirely sure why anything was happening. There didn't feel like there was much direction. And that isn't to say it wasn't entertaining, but it just felt a little hollow at times. I never really got a sense of the main group as a group. Arthur and Ford, sure, but they never really felt affected by joining up with Zaphod and Trillian. They just kind of coexisted, and that's about it. I found a lot of what it did smart and interesting, but I never really felt like I was looking forward to reading it again. This may also have been affected by the fact that the last book I read is my favourite book of all time, but even so, something just felt off, and it's so frustrating because it doesn't feel like it should feel off. I don't really have much more to say. I don't know how to properly articulate it, but my experience towards this book was disappointing. Dr. Seuss adaptations are known for being very hit or miss, with a lot of emphasis put on the miss. I guess it's difficult to capture the wackiness of the books without it being crazy and while still telling a story worthwhile in its own right. Personally, Green Eggs and Ham was the main Dr. Seuss book I read as a kid, so when an adaptation of it was released, I was pretty interested to see how it would be done. After all, the book is very short, so making it into an entire TV series, that's a tough ask. I watched a couple of episodes when it first released, but never finished it, so I decided to finally return to it. How they managed to make an adaptation of Green Eggs and Ham which feels so incredibly faithful to the source material while also being genuinely fantastic in its own right is beyond me, but specifically that first season they nailed so well. The show isn't about Green Eggs and Ham, but they do act as an emotional core of the story. Sam I Am isn't incessantly trying to get Guy Am I to try Green Eggs and Ham for the sake of it. The two of them happen to be in a situation where they need to stick together, as they're harbouring a hunted animal, the chickarap, and Sam tries at every turn to get Guy to try his favourite food, but Guy, a very grumpy person who's only reluctantly in this arrangement at all, refuses because he doesn't want to try new things. In the end, Green Eggs and Ham are shown to be significant to Sam as it symbolises his issues with abandonment and not having anyone he can be close with, as well as being the one link he has to the mother he lost. But what is even more beautiful is the way it symbolises the friendship between Sam and Guy. Over the series, the two become closer, but as things are revealed, the friendship becomes strained and even completely breaks, and this is the moment that Guy proclaims he will never try Green Eggs and Ham. Not here, not there, not anywhere. But then, in the final episode of the season, with their reconciliation, Guy decides as a show of their friendship, he will try Green Eggs and Ham, and he loves them. It sounds silly, but it is very heartfelt, and this show just gets how to tell a compelling and emotional story. But as an adaptation of the Dr. Seuss classic, it is just as good. Each episode is named after one of the things Guy says in the book he will not eat Green Eggs and Ham on or with, and the adventure they go on feels quite naturally built, despite being based around concepts added to the children's book entirely for the rhymes. I also appreciate that they don't make everyone have to rhyme when they speak, as would be tempting to do to make it a fitting adaptation, but the narrator does, and he's a very fun presence across the show. The visual designs are also very reminiscent of the book. Despite being pretty much a completely original story, it feels like about as loyal an adaptation of Green Eggs and Ham as you could possibly get. It just has the story in there too. Season 2 wasn't quite as amazing, focusing on Sam reconnecting with his mother and then the group trying to stop a civil war. It's still good though, but it feels less like an adaptation of the book and more like a sequel to the second season, which realistically it had to be. Either way though, the show as a whole is excellent, especially the first season, which I think is perfect. Me having this book was actually a complete accident. My mum bought me a couple of books for my birthday one year, and this was sent in addition to them for some reason. I was content with never reading it because it's clearly a book for primary school age students, but given I'm trying to have plenty of variety in this challenge, I decided to knock it off my list. So what did I think of this book, clearly made for 9-year-olds? I mean, it wasn't for me, that's for sure, but I actually appreciate what it did a lot more than I expected. The book is about Mr. Gum, who is very much a Mr. Twit type figure. Awful, disgusting, and of poor temperament. When a dog messes up his garden, he decides to poison the dog, and it's up to a girl called Polly to save the dog. Now, This all sounds fairly uninteresting, but the book is very silly. For example, the reason a slob like Mr. Gum even has a nice looking garden is because an angry fairy who lives in his bath whacks him with a frying pan if he doesn't keep it tidy. And the way they cure the dog is by feeding him a chocolate that turns into a dolphin that goes down his throat. The book isn't taking itself seriously at all, and honestly, I can imagine that kids would absolutely love this. There's a few quite funny bits of wit, and some of the silly stuff is bizarre enough to be entertaining, but otherwise there isn't much here for any reader whose age is in double digits. But comparing to Bad Dad, I think this book was self-aware enough to just lean into the silliness and not try to make it something it isn't, and there is a charm to that. I was recommended Return of the Obra Dinn last year by a friend I was visiting in Paris, as I'd expressed my interest in unique, story-driven games like Immortality. While certainly different, Return of the Obra Dinn sounded pretty interesting, so I downloaded it as soon as I got back home and gave it a try. And it was pretty much everything I'd been told it was, but upon hitting a roadblock I lost the drive to complete it and played The Case of the Golden Idol instead, which is very similar, and I actually ended up completing that, although I did use a guide. I decided this year to finally return to the Obra Dinn and start again. Boy, what a game! In it, you have to board the Obra Dinn, a ship whose crew have almost all died, and use a magic pocket watch called the Memento Mortem to view a snapshot of various characters' deaths and deduce who each person is and how they died. It's so hard to make deductive reasoning truly work in a video game, as having to interpret written text from the player would be a bit difficult for most games. This game still makes it essentially multiple choice, but as you have to choose from 60 different people, many different ways to die, and often who killed them, it really relies on your deduction skills, and it's difficult to solve through brute force. There were a couple of times when I did use brute force, but that was mainly when, for example, I had 4 Chinese characters and knew their fates, so I just had to swap the names around a bit until I got the right ones. Even these are possible to get through pure deduction, as you can compare hammock numbers, and some of the ways I was able to deduce things are pretty great. For example, the way I figured out who was the bosun's mate was because I had a topman, 2 seamen, and the bosun's mate whose identities I didn't know. But in the first part of the Bitter Cold chapter, Charles Minor was the only one not present, as he has his own room, being the bosun's mate, while the others are all in hammocks that are present in the scene. This is a game that makes you feel smart for spotting the little things and forming conclusions from the evidence provided, with a smidge of racial profiling thrown in there as well. The plot is intriguing, and I love how it unravels and how things get even crazier the deeper you dig. It's visually unlike anything else I've played, and I just really love playing this. It's very much a game you can only play once, but I would love to be able to introduce this to someone someday and see how they approach it, and if they're able to figure out things I was unable to. It's weird that 1997 was almost 30 years ago. Why am I musing on such a random year? Well, as it happens, 1997 was the year I was born. It's weird, to me the 90s and early 2000s have always felt fairly contemporary, and so a film like Men in Black does too. Only reason this popped into my head is because I only really know Vincent D'Onofrio from Daredevil, so I was incredibly confused when I saw in the credits that he was in this film. Honestly, looking at Edgar and then looking at Kingpin, they can't be the same actor. Anyway, that isn't really related to my thoughts on the film, but I do think it's interesting that a film like this still largely feels like it could have been made today. I mean, there are some signs of age in how it looks, but it doesn't feel like a 30-year-old film in the same way a 1970 film would have when this film released. It's a really fun film, a great example of comedy sci-fi, something I've experienced plenty of this year, and this definitely ranks highly on that. If I'm honest, the biggest weakness was that I didn't get that much of a sense of Kay and Jay's bond over the film, but maybe I just missed it. The world it created was every bit as crazy as you'd think, and it maybe bounced around ideas a bit too fast in a roughly hour-and-a-half runtime that feels really short by today's standards, but overall it was a lot of fun to see all the quirky aliens and how they've blended into the world. Yeah, pretty good, and another classic I can knock off my list. I haven't got the most experience when it comes to Monkey Ball games, but I have played a couple and they're fun, unique games. It wouldn't normally be a game I'd buy for myself, but Banana Rumble looked pretty cool, I'd heard good things about it, and I got it a little cheaper, so I figured, why not? It was a very nice experience, and I feel like I got my money's worth, even if it isn't an instant favourite for me. I was actually kind of worried when I started playing it that it would be too easy and would be underwhelming, and honestly, for the first 6 or 7 worlds, the levels felt fairly easy. But then the difficulty spiked, and it spiked hard. Not too much mind. I was starting to spend more time on the levels, but it never felt like victory was out of reach. The only exception was the level Tornado Rings, which felt completely luck based and unfun, but every other level was really good. I also found it quite satisfying that on the last level I managed to complete it in exactly 1 minute. What a way to end it. This was a pretty fun time for the weekend, and I'll have to try out the multiplayer at some point. The Bear was actually the first show I watched for this challenge, but seeing as it got a 3rd season this year, which I didn't know was happening at the time, I decided to move my review of it to this point in the year. Most of it will be the same as I wrote in January though, as Season 3, while probably my least favourite season, was still excellent and didn't fundamentally change my feelings towards it. I first heard about The Bear from a trailer that always played on YouTube for it. It was the same scene every time, the one where Carmen meets Sydney, but it intrigued me to the point that I never skipped it. I had an interest in watching it, but in the end I didn't, and I stopped seeing the ad and I kinda forgot about it. Then my friend dressed as Carmen for Halloween and my interest was immediately reignited. Well, as it happens, I loved it immediately. I think I watched the first half season the first night I watched it, and from then I was hooked. Describing it is difficult though. It's funny, but also incredibly heartfelt. The characters are so volatile, but still lovable. It almost feels kind of slice of life, but if everything was stressful. Getting to see inside the lives of these people, the things they want, the things they feel, the things that hurt them, is a joy. Oh, and the food looks so good. Very bad show to watch while I'm on a diet, but I got through it. The characters really are the star of the show. I could try to pick a favourite, but it's just not possible because they're all great. Tina is so prickly, but at the first sign of positive affirmation, she becomes the biggest teddy bear. Richie is just the biggest tool ever, but full of insecurities, and when he can get past them, he ends up being incredibly charming and likeable. The way Sydney reacts to things is always hilarious to me, and she might be my outright favourite, except I still haven't quite forgiven her for how horrible she was to Richie in the season 1 finale. And then Marcus just wants to make donuts, and I really want him to make donuts. Guy's just wholesome. I really enjoy spending time with these characters, and seeing them grow and develop and become closer, especially in Season 2, was awesome. As I said, Season 3 was my least favourite, and that was in part because there were too many episodes which differed from the norm. The very weird first episode, the Tina backstory, and the Labour episode. I actually still enjoyed some of these, especially the Tina episode, but it did feel like it hurt the flow of the season. But that's more of a nitpick, and I still love this show and can't wait for the next season. In 2005, Nintendo held the first Nintendo Game Seminar. Well, that's not strictly speaking true, there was one the year before that, but it isn't actually particularly relevant, for reasons I'll go into another time. This was where Nintendo held game design classes for Japanese students, which would eventually lead to the students being split into groups and making their own DS games. The really cool thing about this is that these games were actually released by Nintendo, albeit in a very limited fashion. They were distributed from DS download stations exclusively in Japan, and only for a period of like 2 weeks. These game seminars were held every year up until 2010, and then, after a 3-year break, they returned it for 2013 and 2014, where the games were instead developed for the Wii U and distributed on the eShop. These games, due to their Japan-only status, incredibly limited availability, and the fact that they were basically not marketed, means that they are almost inarguably the most obscure Nintendo games ever published. They are, in fact, so obscure that almost no information exists about them online. There's some gameplay footage available for some of them, and everyone has a screenshot or two and a brief description of them online, but many of them don't have any video footage online, and it's difficult to even imagine what, for example, Bioom would even really be like. I've been somewhat obsessed with these games since I ran my Every Franchises Here Twitter account, where I tried to come up with a Smash character concept for every single Nintendo franchise, and the Game Seminar games were included in that. And what always struck me about them was how creative and fun they seemed, and I desperately wanted to find them, but I couldn't find a way to. If there were any ROMs of them out there, they were buried deep, beyond where my terrible research skills could take me. But then, a few months ago, after trying to ask about them on Reddit, someone directed me to Miriam, where some, but not all, of the Game Seminar ROMs could be found. And while I struggled back then to actually find them, I decided to try again now, and I did find them. And I actually legitimately had tears in my eyes when I was finally able to boot one up. It's felt like I've been searching for them forever, but I found them. Some of them at least. I'm planning on making a video on these games next year, but for now I wanted to talk about the one Game Seminar game I completed, Pulpy. The game is in Japanese, but the story has images to go with it. Pulpy is chilling on his very own cloud with his friends when suddenly his cloud bursts and he falls all the way down the mountain that he lives on. So he has to try and get back up to his friends. In the game, you control Pulpy by using the stylus to pull him around circular planets, kind of like in Mario Galaxy, and stretching him to reach other planets. It's a simple concept, but of course, this idea is built upon with different ways of interacting with this ability and different enemy types to avoid. The game is quite fun. The one negative I have is that Pulpy is kinda hard to control at times. You drag Pulpy with the stylus, but the camera is centered on Pulpy and moves with him, so if you aren't careful, he'll go shooting in the direction that you've started to drag him. I was able to get used to this though, and zipping between planets is quite satisfying. It also has a very nice visual style and animations, and a catchy soundtrack, and the difficulty scales really well, with the final post-game level being just difficult enough to feel like a worthy final test, but not too frustrating. I had a really great time with Pulpy. It took about 20 minutes for me to beat the main game, and then a further 20 minutes to beat the post-game level, and I really loved the short time I had with it. You wouldn't know this was a student-made game if you weren't told. I wanted to close this out with a sort of call to arms. I'd love to be able to play all the Game Seminar games, but I'm currently unable to due to not having the ROMs for any of them other than the ones from 2009, 2010, 2013 and 2014. If anyone has any idea where these ROMs might be able to be found, please let me know. It would be such a shame if these became lost media. I find it baffling that Starfy has had little presence in the West. A fun platformer with a cute protagonist feels like something that has no reason to stay in Japan. So it was really great to see that the 3 GBA Starfy games were being added to NSO, and added in the West as well as Japan to boot. That's awesome. There's actually a lot of dialogue in the game, and I didn't really get what was happening half the time honestly, which was a slight issue with some of the actual objectives within the levels, but nothing was too difficult to work out, and even the story was pretty basic all things considered, so I picked up on that fairly well too. Would my experience have been better if it was translated? Definitely, but that isn't how NSO works, and I still had a great time with it anyway. The game is, more than anything else, a lot of fun. It's a platformer, but much of it takes place underwater, and yet that doesn't feel like it compromises the platformer aspect. Both above water and in water gameplay feels fun and satisfying, and there's plenty of gameplay variety even beyond that. It's a very cute game, lovely visuals, it has incredibly fun and interesting bosses, and it throws some challenge in there too. Although I would say the game overall is on the easier side, but no more than most modern platformers like Mario Wonder, and that I consider to be an amazing game. It's also relatively short, as I was able to complete it in a single sitting of a few hours, but it's also a GBA game that I may as well have gotten for free as I was already subscribed to the NSO expansion, so I cannot and will not complain about that. All in all, if this was translated, I may have fallen head over heels in love with it, but as it is, I still really enjoyed it and I will absolutely be playing the rest of the series. I don't know why exactly I felt the desire to watch Douglas is cancelled. Maybe I'm just interested in the entire topic, social politics and cancel culture and the like. And I guess in the first couple of episodes I felt like it was a show made a couple of years too late. With Musk at the helm of Twitter and more people becoming unfazed by the idea of being cancelled, and many more people supporting people who not too long ago would have been wiped out of the public consciousness, cancel culture really no longer exists. No longer is it everyone against these individuals, and now it's down to which side you fall on. The woke and the anti-woke. You have support on whichever side you're on, that's for sure. So this show's idea of cancelled isn't really relevant to a modern discussion. The show also really tried too hard to use woke terminology for Claudia that just doesn't work anymore. I don't think I've heard anyone actually say okay boomer in like 2 years. Of course, the show isn't really about cancel culture. That's the setting, sure, but there's something much more important and frankly much more powerful going on under the surface, which episode 3 and 4 start to introduce. It's about the realistic scenarios women in media and probably other industries will find themselves in, and why it's so difficult to just not give in and do whatever it takes. It isn't a case of just saying no, and that's made incredibly clear. I do worry that the ending where it's revealed that Madeline ended up rejecting Toby's advances could undermine that idea, but then I guess it shouldn't even matter because the scenario shouldn't happen in the first place. I think the show was incredibly powerful, especially episode 4, and I think a lot of that has to fall on the shoulders of Karen Gillan. As a Doctor Who and Marvel fan, it's safe to say I'm a fan of Karen Gillan too, and her characters are always fantastic, but this was unlike Amy Pond and Nebula. She starts off as an enigma, as it's near impossible to tell whose side she's truly on, whether she likes or hates Douglas, whether she's sincere in helping him or has ulterior motives, and there's a perfect push and pull, which never really concludes until Douglas finally makes his fatal slip-up. She seems often quite manipulative, rehearsed even, but by the end it becomes clear that this is because of the environment she exists in, and the fact that she knows that she has to do what she has to do in order to survive. She was an absolute standout, and Karen Gillan's performance was what brought it all together. Douglas' cancel took me by surprise. I was expecting a rather cringeworthy depiction of cancel culture, and it was a bit outdated, but I don't think it really mattered because it set the stage for a far more important story. Also, I love the fact that 2 of the people in this show are a mother-daughter duo in Doctor Who, and you'd never guess which 2. At this point of the year, around mid-July, I've actually already completed part of this challenge. I've played 12 games that I had never played before this year. That means that from this point on, I will be addressing my backlog. Or deciding to play flash games from my childhood instead? Yeah, let's do that instead. Achievement Unlocked has a fairly simple premise. You're an elephant in a 2D platforming room full of spikes and boost strips that launch you into the air, and you have to complete 100 different objectives. Examples of these achievements include dying 100 times, visiting certain points of the map in certain orders, having 5 of your corpses on screen at once, muting the game, clicking the screen even though it has no purpose, pressing up and down at the same time, typing the developer's name, typing in the Konami code, and so on. Honestly, I find it personally very satisfying seeing all these achievements getting unlocked, especially towards the beginning where usually about half of them get unlocked really quickly. I do feel more variety in the types of achievements would be good, but this isn't really meant to be that deep. It's a flash game, a fairly simple time waster, and it does that really well. I never actually completed it as a kid as I found it too difficult to touch some of the ceiling tiles, but I gave it a go now and I managed to beat it. Nice simple stroll down memory lane. By the way, if you're wondering how I was able to play flash games, I used a program called Flashpoint. It's an incredible archival effort for as many flash games as possible. I love being able to play games I thought were lost to me forever through this, and I would recommend it as a way to re-experience one's youth. I knew a Mario game would have to be on this list. It's my favourite video game franchise ever, so I needed to log something from it during this challenge. There are actually many Mario games I haven't completed, even if I have played almost all of them, but of them all, the one that felt the most doable was 64. After all, games like the original Super Mario Bros. Or Super Mario Land just get super hard towards the end. The more open nature of 64 would make it a bit easier as I could just choose the easiest stars. Oh, how wrong I was. I'm gonna say something that shouldn't be as controversial as it will be. Super Mario 64 is not a good game. Now, before you sharpen your pitchforks, hear me out. I am well aware of how important and impactful it is. It was essentially the first of its kind, the genesis point of the 3D platformer, and it revolutionised how things like the camera in 3D games could be handled. That's great. The issue is that if you ignore how important and impactful it is and judge based on the actual quality of the game, it's just bad. The game is often lauded for its movement options, and yeah, there's a lot of them, but frankly it doesn't make much difference when the physics are unbearably bad. Mario feels both not responsive enough and also too responsive, leading to frustrating moments where you want to move just a tiny bit, but he just won't go, and then you randomly go shooting too far in that direction. Mario has never been as slippy as this, and it's so easy to overshoot a jump and go falling down a whole level. Mario clings to walls almost on instinct, and that makes some of the more precise moments unbearable. And I didn't even realise wall jumping was a thing because it's difficult to pull off and has no visual cue that you can. And the camera. Oh lord, the camera. It's revolutionary, but it doesn't do a damn thing I want it to. It doesn't help that these levels are not designed for a game with this finickier controls and physics system. What do you mean I have to hide behind this penguin on an icy floor, or else a giant snowman will blow me down the mountain and I'll have to take the trek all the way back up? It's so stupid, and there's so much more to complain about. Why are there so many slopes in levels that send you flying down from high heights? Why is it so hard to get out of water? Why does fire follow you when it has the awful effect of making you run around uncontrollably? Why do certain types of moving platform flip over at the top? Why are there just randomly certain almost vertical surfaces you can run up with no indication as to why? Why are enemies like Chuckyers put in positions that make them almost impossible to avoid? Why is that rabbit so difficult to catch? Why does the game tell you that you are invincible as Metal Mario, only to let you get hurt by a clam? Why does the game kick you out of the level every time you die? Why does exiting a stage take you to the entrance of Peach's castle, rather than the entrance of the level you just came from? Why are certain things so hard to grab that you have to be practically inside it while it's moving around in order to grab it? Why is this game so ugly? Why do the levels look like they just threw random assets together? Why is the wing cap so hard to both activate and actually use? How the heck do I get that pink bob-omb in Wet Dry World? Now I'll be fair, I did enjoy a fair amount of the game. I wouldn't necessarily say most of it, but the game has some positives. The game's earlier levels are actually a lot of fun and work well with the actual systems in place. None of the bosses were all that difficult, but that also means they weren't as frustrating as the rest of the game. The exception of course being the last Bowser fight, but that's meant to be as it's the final boss. While I think some of the levels feel poorly realised, there are plenty that have really cool concepts like Tiny Huge Island and Tick-Tock Clock, and some of it feels a lot more ambitious than it has any right to be. Even though more of the music is reused than I would like, what is there is really good. The game has some good parts, but it all comes together in a package that just doesn't hit most of the notes it needs to. And to be clear once again, I am aware of the fact that it was the first of its kind. There was no template at the time, and what they built considering that is impressive, and we should all be glad they did, or who knows what 3D platformers would look like now. But when I compare it to games I've played of the era, like Spyro and Banjo, 64 just does not compare in terms of its actual quality. And when so many people try to insist that any game other than 64 is the worst 3D Mario game, well, I have to question how they can justify that without taking into account factors like nostalgia and its impact, which shouldn't really be used when directly comparing games from different eras. I haven't seen a lot of biopics about musicians, and while I know a lot of Weird Al's music through cultural osmosis, I don't specifically listen to him. But considering Weird is meant to be an anti-biopic, a parody of biopics in general, well, I knew I'd have a good time with it regardless. And I did for sure. I love the fact that the film starts off in the first few minutes feeling fairly normal, or at least what you'd expect from a biopic of Weird Al, but then his dad beats a man halfway to death over an accordion, then Weird Al becomes the biggest artist in the world and an international sex symbol, then it's revealed that Michael Jackson's Beat It was actually a parody of Eat It, then he starts dating Madonna, then he kills Pablo Escobar, and you start to think that actually, maybe this didn't happen? The film was funny, and I honestly found every way it leaned into the tropes of biopics to be brilliant. Daniel Radcliffe as Weird Al is inspired because not only does he look nothing like Weird Al, but he actually manages to capture both the really weird, unsure Al and also the confident, brash Al really well in a way that does still feel like one character. I think the cameo of Weird Al himself was great, and the way it ends, with Weird Al being killed and the film ending on a somber note, before revealing he would come back as a zombie, was perfect. The credits in general were fantastic as well. A weird thing happened actually. I watched this film in 2 sittings as I didn't have time to do the whole thing in one, but in between that I actually saw a thread on Twitter about animated shows Weird Al has been in, and I never realised that he played Milo in Milo Murphy's Law, a show I actually watched last year. And now whenever I hear Al's voice I can only hear Milo. Weird. Parodies of classic children's literature have gained a lot of popularity in the last decade or so. I have a great love for many classic children's books like The Very Hungry Caterpillar and The Tiger Who Came to Tea, so seeing these concepts twisted in a satirical way to focus on a more adult audience, such as The Very Hungover Caterpillar and The Teenager Who Came to Tea, is fun. They aren't exactly hilarious, and they are mostly just low-hanging fruit, but reading one of them can be an amusing 5 minutes. I've always had a particular fondness for Roger Hargreaves' Mr. Men books, and used to have a lot of these as a kid. I don't anymore, but when I have kids, they are absolutely getting the full set. Mr. Greedy Eats Clean to Get Lean was a gift that I got maybe a couple of years ago, mostly as a joke because I very much like to eat. I was sorting through the books on my bookshelf and I saw this one hidden at the back, so I figured I'd have a short break to read it. Seeing as I'm currently in the process of my own weight loss journey, it seemed a relevant thing to read. I feel like most of my previous comments still apply. It's mildly entertaining, but mostly low-hanging fruit. There is one thing I loved though, and that's that the images are mostly taken directly from previous Mr. Men and Little Miss books. That's a nice touch. Otherwise, not too much to say, it's pretty much exactly what you expect. It took me 3 years to beat Breath of the Wild. This was not for lack of playing it. I didn't play it constantly, and I would often take breaks of months at a time, but when I was playing it, I was playing it for days or weeks at a time. The reason it took me so long is because I always got distracted. Why invade the Yiga hideout when there are so many Koroks to find? The world was so interesting to just explore. It's taken me just over a year to beat Tears of the Kingdom, but this time it's not for the same reason. I played it a lot for the first couple of weeks I had it, and then I just lost interest. Breath of the Wild was special, but Tears of the Kingdom, being largely the same, just didn't feel as special, and so I didn't have the drive to play it. This year I decided that through hell or high water I was going to finish the game, and so I started playing it. And I continued playing it. And at first it felt more like an obligation to the challenge, but then I started to enjoy the game more and more and more. By the end, I was confident in saying that I love it even more than Breath of the Wild. It is true that Tears of the Kingdom never quite manages to capture the same spirit of adventuring through a new land for the same time that Breath of the Wild does, mostly because this ultimately is not a new land. The map itself is largely the same, with most areas having changed in some way, but still being the same places. The Sky World is a cool concept, but there isn't as much of it as you'd expect, and it's too hard to get to feel worth it. The Depths is also cool, but most of it feels like the same thing over and over again. I did actually find most of the light routes, and trying to make the way through the dark was an interesting challenge, but ultimately I do feel like I'd seen all the Depths had to offer within the first couple of hours. This isn't to say the world doesn't have things worth exploring. It did for sure, and there was always something to do. But the real star of the show was the main quest line. Breath of the Wild just had the divine beasts and then some optional stuff, and granted much of the optional stuff like getting the Master Sword or finding the memories was similar in this game, but there were things like a surprise 5th temple or a Phantom Ganon fight that made it all feel a bit meatier. It also felt a lot more rewarding as the plot was pretty engaging. But the star of the show was that final boss. The moment Ganon unleashes his power and the health bar goes up and up and up and just refuses to stop until it practically hits the right side of the screen was a heck of a moment. The battle was incredibly tough, but learning Ganondorf's attacks and how to parry his parries was so satisfying when I finally beat him. And then it still isn't over, as you have to beat Ganondorf in his dragon form, and as tempting as it is to draw comparisons to Gobblegut from Super Mario Galaxy 2, it was an epic final confrontation. Much easier than the main battle with Ganondorf, sure, but frankly I quite like this type of victory lap boss battle. It isn't trying to challenge you, it's trying to create an epic set piece, and it certainly does that. None of that is even to mention things like the much greater variety of enemies, although the loss of the Guardians is tragic, or how amazing Ultra Hand and Fuse are for adding depth to this game. Breath of the Wild was pretty special, absolutely, but this game makes it feel super bare bones in comparison. I'm so glad I managed to finally push myself to finish it. Oscar Wilde was very famously a gay man. I don't know whether or not that painted my perception of the start of the novel, but frankly I just cannot imagine there is any way that the interactions between Dorian, Basil and Henry were ever intended to be entirely straight. Maybe things were different in the 19th century, but the way that Basil and Henry fawn over Dorian, the way they are drawn to him, specifically his looks, and the way that Basil finds himself so utterly obsessed with Dorian, this simply doesn't feel platonic. And that's no bad thing. I actually think it enhances the story to have that potential undertone. In addition, I think there's a certain energy about the picture of Dorian Gray that is completely engrossing, especially whenever there's dialogue. I found it greatly enjoyable to just see these characters interacting and seeing the dynamics between them. As for what it means, I don't feel like I was able to decipher it entirely, but I do feel that corruption is a big theme. Dorian in the beginning was a very innocent figure, but then Basil and Henry enter his life and they both have their own corrupting grasps on him. Henry is probably the most obvious, as Dorian specifically says that the book Henry gives him is what had such a massive effect on him, but the true corruption that Henry's influence brought on was the corruption of class, a factor which did twist Dorian in many ways. But Basil also corrupted Dorian, in this case a corruption of vanity, feeding into his desire to be youthful and beautiful forever, which obviously kicks off the entire plot really. Both these men corrupt Dorian in their own ways, and both in that way are involved in the incident that leads to Dorian cutting ties with Sybil Vane, which leads not just to her suicide, but also the beginning of Dorian's change. After all, the reason Dorian does this is because he now views her performance as unappealing, both lacking in beauty and also now not socially acceptable for him to marry. And then the cycle of corruption continues as Dorian himself corrupts many people as he draws them into his influence, although in more drastic ways, mostly drugs. I found the book fascinating, although it did feel weird to me that the picture changing didn't happen until near enough halfway through the book. I also found chapter 11 a slog to get through, as its function was to address the large time jump, but it ended up spending way too long talking about the different pursuits Dorian had taken up. Sure, it does do a good job at setting up that Dorian lives a very adventurous lifestyle, but I didn't really need that many examples of different gems he had an interest in and why. It just got long-winded. But otherwise, I found the whole thing fascinating. Roald Dahl was a massive part of my growing up. I read a lot of his books, watched the films that were available at the time, and even read a Roald Dahl based magazine. I think Roald Dahl is actually where my interest in reading properly started, and while I think I would have gotten into reading sooner or later regardless, it is nice to think that this is where it truly started for me. I've read most of his books before, and the ones I haven't read, I mostly don't own. But one I know I haven't ever read, but I do still own, is The Giraffe and the Pelly and Me. Might as well read it for this challenge. This isn't one of Roald Dahl's strongest, and being one of the shorter books doesn't help with that. Obviously in that case, not much can really be expanded upon, and it can't fully flesh out characters. That's not really an issue in a Roald Dahl book, but it is worth noting I think. The story is a simple one, but it is entertaining enough for what it is, even if it relies on a lot of coincidence and circumstance that makes it feel rushed. Their first window cleaning job is for the richest man in the country, who happens to be really nice and is also being robbed at the exact same time, a situation the giraffe, the Pelly and the monkey are perfectly equipped for. There were things I liked though. The reference to Willy Wonka in the end was cool, and I liked that each of the three animals would sing songs, which ended up being more like poems, but it was cool that each animal used a different type of poem. The existence of the monkey confuses me though, because he doesn't have much of a role. Sure, his role in the window cleaning business is to actually wipe the windows, but in the actual plot he doesn't do much. The giraffe gets to show off her long neck, and the Pelly not only helps Billy pick the cherries, but also single-handedly stops the burglar. The monkey has no role in the story really. Well, he does sing the song that gives the book its name, but even the name feels weird. The Giraffe and the Pelly and Me doesn't feel like it describes the book very well, as it names the giraffe and the Pelly but not the monkey, which is fine except the book is from the perspective of Billy, so it feels like the me should be describing Billy there. Maybe there was a version of the story without the monkey, where Billy takes that role instead, hence why it's named that way. But maybe Roald Dahl decided that having three animals would work better, so he added the monkey, but kept the original story intact. The title sounded catchier as is, so it was kept the same, and the song was created to justify that title. And the actual design of the monkey was based on the Mugglewump from The Enormous Crocodile, as maybe the book was far enough down the line that there was no point in Quentin Blake creating an all-new design. Or probably not, but it seemed like an interesting hypothesis to me. After my Smash Bros video in July got a lot of attention, a few people mentioned that in my Castlevania picks I'd included the Netflix trio. This reminded me that a couple of years ago I had tried watching Castlevania, watched a couple of episodes and, despite enjoying it, just never finished it. It gave me the itch to give it another go, as I had remembered that it was quite good, and I was right. Castlevania is really good, although I do think each of the seasons pulls what it's trying to do to varying degrees of success. The first season is only 4 episodes long, and it's a good 4 episodes, but it felt more like a taster than anything. Season 2 is where it really gets going, not just because it's 8 episodes this time, but I think the central trio of Trevor, Cypher and Alucard is a killer dynamic. They bounce off each other incredibly, especially the banter that manages to get thrown around between them, and they're all likeable, interesting and entertaining characters in their own right. I also think that, despite him being depressed for most of it, Dracula is an incredible presence, especially when you see his rage. However, he's killed at the end of Season 2, and Season 3 feels like it suffers for that, as Carmilla just isn't as engaging as an antagonist, and Alucard is separated from Trevor and Cypher. Trevor and Cypher together are still an excellent dynamic, but Alucard suffers a little for being put with two completely new characters. The bigger issue, however, is that it tries to split itself across too many plot lines. You have Trevor and Cypher, then Saint Germain, Isaac, Alucard, Carmilla and her vampire sisters, with Lenore and Hector having their own plot line. It's a lot, and none of them feel fleshed out enough. This issue continues into most of Season 4, but by episode 8 and 9, most of the plot lines have been closed, and it focuses in mainly on the plot lines following Alucard, Trevor and Cypher. And it's to its strength, particularly when the three are finally reunited. Throughout the whole show, two things were always stellar: the voice acting and the action. I watched the dub, as I always do for anime, but the voice cast really had some prestige, with Richard Armitage being the main name I'd heard of. I don't think there was a single voice performance that was subpar. It was excellent. And the action, oh the action. Every fight scene was stellar. They were always a blast, and they were just so damn cool. I also like the use of gore. Unlike something like Invincible, the gore felt much more naturally integrated. It was rarely the focus, often it was blink and you miss it, and even not focused on at all. It was there, but not in your face, and I can kinda respect that. This show was at its strongest in Season 2, undeniably, but there was plenty to love throughout. And sure, apparently the creators hadn't played the game, thus it isn't a great adaptation, but I haven't played much Castlevania, so that wasn't an issue for me. My mum and I used to watch a lot of TV together. I guess this is on my mind as I moved away from home literally yesterday as of writing, and so the days of us watching a whole series together are probably gone or less likely to happen. And while we used to watch a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, like Firefly, Supernatural and Falling Skies, one of the more unusual things she got me into was reality TV. She's been a fan of Big Brother since the first British season, and together we watched things like I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, The Apprentice, The Great British Bake Off, Married at First Sight, and The Circle, the first British season of which I think is a perfect season of reality TV. It's a special thing we've always shared, and I'm probably going to continue to watch reality TV just so it's something we can talk about. I think this is what made me so interested in The Truman Show, because it basically tells a story of reality TV on a bigger scale than has ever been done before, one probably not possible in the real world. But the idea of a man's entire life being shown and documented, moulded and manipulated from his very birth, that is just fascinating. If it was real, I'm not sure whether I would be a fan or completely outraged at its unethical nature, but I have to say that the reality TV fan in me finds the prospect appealing. There are a few things that make this film work. It balances the tension and the fun so delicately, but so perfectly. Jim Carrey isn't necessarily firing on all crazy cylinders as he's clearly capable of, but he does hold a lot of that same energy, and it really helps to show Truman's descent into madness as he unravels the mystery of what is happening. I also think the way that they explain how it's all possible is great, and I like that they make clear that there was a progression of technology while also using a mostly 50s aesthetic. In a way, this makes it feel like it could have taken place at any time. A version of the mid-20th century where technology was far more advanced, or the far-flung future. Either works, as we see little outside of the dome and less that would indicate the time period of the outside world. Also, I went back and forth on this, but I actually like that we were privy to the fact that Truman was part of a TV show the whole time. While it would have been an intriguing mystery, I do feel like seeing the inner workings and how everyone reacts to what Truman does is far more entertaining, and there's still a thrill in seeing whether or not Truman actually makes it out of the show. My one criticism, and it isn't even really a criticism, is that I found myself wanting to see what happened next. Sometimes the end of a show or a film should be the end, and there's no reason to see what comes next, how things pan out. This doesn't feel like one of those. While seeing Truman actually working out what is going on is interesting, seeing him interacting with the real world, adapting to a harsher society, dealing with his immense fame, trying to find Sylvia, that stuff would all have been just as interesting to see. Sure, we can imagine it, but I feel this is a case where some sort of follow-up would have been brilliant. I guess it says a lot when the main thing I'd change about a movie is just to have more of it. For some reason, I've never really seen myself as the target demographic for young adult novels, even when I was a young adult myself. Sure, often it feels like there's definitely a female audience leaning to a lot of them, but overall I feel like most are fairly consumable for all people within that age range. I guess part of the reason was because I'd read and enjoyed my fair share of adult novels as well. I was the one kid at school who had to read Of Mice and Men and actually enjoyed it, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't love young adult novels at that age as well, and I've read a lot of them. I've read a couple through this challenge so far, but most of what I've read has been either books for adults or kids. Breathe feels like it's about as stereotypically young adult as it can get. What if the world was lacking oxygen? Let's follow our teenage protagonists as they become the catalyst towards uncovering a conspiracy and crumbling a corrupt regime. It's pretty standard stuff, and as I started to read it, I felt sure that I'd just grown out of young adult novels because all I could see were cliches, uninteresting plot points, a world that was only vaguely interesting, and a love triangle that made me cringe. The thing about young adult stories is that they're easy reads and very digestible, so I actually managed to read the majority of this book in 2 days, compared to The Picture of Dorian Gray, which took me almost a month. And to be clear, I like the latter better, but young adult as a genre is just easy to let yourself get lost in, regardless of quality. Fortunately for me, things did get better. I do still feel like the world itself isn't super interesting. I mean, there are some interesting elements, but the specific what if that most young adult novels pose kind of feels like a MacGuffin at this point. There might be some specific things that make it interesting, but overall a lot of these concepts feel interchangeable, and you could tell a similar story to Breathe while replacing the concept of what if there was no oxygen with anything. Like, what if there was no water? Or what if there was no light? The actual specifics feel more like the flavouring, and this is usually why they need to have stronger characters to actually make it feel worth it. This book does not have stellar characters, but it's hard not to get invested in them, and I was very glad that the love triangle was never really a love triangle. It still feels a little forced for Quinn to have just never been interested in Bee, but falls head over heels for Alina at first sight, but I do like that there isn't even a hint of Alina having any interest in him, and that the romance with Quinn and Bee is resolved with plenty of time. I actually really like how they showed Quinn realising that he's in love with her. It felt a lot more natural than I expected. I think the most interesting part of this book is the approach to perspective. The entire story is told from a first-person perspective, but each chapter focuses that perspective on one of the 3 main characters. It isn't completely unique, but it is a much rarer presentation for a story, and I think it has some merits. I especially like that there doesn't seem to be any inclination to stretch chapters out to be a certain length, with one chapter being less than a page long. The chapters are as long as they need to be, and sometimes when perspective needs to change multiple times quite quickly, it does that. I do think that this kind of thing would work better if each of the 3 characters had a distinctly different narrator voice, as it's sometimes difficult to feel like we're following a new person when they sound the same as the character in the last chapter. I also feel like something like this would be even cooler if other characters were able to get chapters from their perspectives. I would have loved to see Blue Maud or the Pod Minister or Jazz get their own chapters, as their perspectives could have been really interesting, but it just never happened, and I think that's a massive missed opportunity. I had a lot more to say about this book than I really expected, considering I don't think it's anything special. Not bad, not even close, but there are many other young adult books I would rather read. That said, I enjoyed it well enough, and I'll certainly be checking out the next book in the series at some point. We first got our power washer years ago, and I always found it to be quite a lot of fun. Sure, all you're really doing is cleaning a patio or a car, but it's satisfying to see the dirt come off so easily under the pressure of the water. It was always me who would do any power washing we needed to do, simply because I enjoyed it, even though I found it a little painful to do for too long. When I first heard about Power Wash Simulator, I had to laugh because of course they would make a power washing simulator. When I first saw it on Xbox Game Pass, I figured I'd try it for a laugh. When I completed the game this year, I had fallen in love with it. Power washing is a pretty satisfying pastime already, so it fits a video game format obscenely well, and it translates into that exactly as you would want. I found myself pouring hours into it, my family watching on baffled because why on earth would I be playing a game about something so mundane? I guess it's difficult to explain really, and that's fine because I only really need myself to understand it. Only reason I stopped playing it until this year was because I found that I was playing a lot in the evenings and I was falling asleep a lot while I was playing it, which was a bit of a pain. When I moved out in July, I wasn't able to take the Switch with me, as it's the family Switch, but I was able to take the Xbox One, and so I figured it made sense, with a fair bit more free time and not as many console options as before, to finally finish the game. I spent hours of my time listening to Mini Minute Man videos on YouTube while watching a treehouse or a subway station, and it was a great way for me to unwind. As well as the generally fun gameplay, I also love the little story that is told through text messages as you clean, and the bizarre climax is a real treat too. They could have made a really basic game here, but there's so much charm and flair on top of the satisfying gameplay, I don't really think there are many ways you can flaw it at all. I have an interesting relationship with Star Wars. I definitely watched the original trilogy as a kid, but I didn't remember more than the basic details at the time. I watched the prequels, although my memories are most strong for The Phantom Menace, but only because of the fact that I played through its levels in LEGO Star Wars religiously as a kid, and refused to play any others. Then I rewatched the films just before The Force Awakens, and I loved The Force Awakens. And then I watched The Last Jedi, and it became my favourite Star Wars film. Don't worry, I still hated The Rise of Skywalker. Outside Rogue One and LEGO Star Wars, I've never actually engaged with any other Star Wars media, and that mostly includes the streaming shows that came out on Disney+. I did actually watch the first couple of episodes of The Mandalorian, but you guessed it, I never finished it. This was mostly because it came out not too long before I spent all of 2021 watching every Marvel film and show, so I didn't have time to invest myself in anything else. My mum and my brother have been watching it and all the other Star Wars films and shows ever since I moved out, so I figured I'd try to catch up with them at least on this one. The Mandalorian, especially when using practical effects, looks like it could have been plucked right out of the same era the original ones were filmed and just made more high definition, which is something I've always disliked about the prequels because it never really gave that same vibe and almost doesn't look like the same world. But of course, the star of the show is Grogu, and beyond just that, his bond with Din Djarin. Grogu is adorable of course, but also mischievous enough that it's always a delight to see the camera focus on him, even when the grown-ups are talking. I overall think there was a very solid cast of characters, a plot I was engaged in, and a lot of great world building, plus it's always nice to see a new lightsaber colour drop. But it was Grogu that always kept me coming back, and I love seeing the Mandalorian's growing affection for him. You know, I feel like there would be a really interesting drinking game you could play with this video. Anytime I say, I started a show, watched the first 1 to 2 episodes, enjoyed it but never went back to it, take a drink. Or probably don't because you might get alcohol poisoning. Either way, living with yourself is one of those. I remember it being intriguing back then and hey, Paul Rudd is always a nice face to see in something like that. However, one of my bigger issues with it is the fact that it's listed as a comedy because it feels like it barely delivers on that. Don't get me wrong, there are funny moments, but they are much fewer and further between than I would have expected, and I feel like only once or twice did I actually laugh at anything. This, however, I don't inherently see as an issue because I remembered it from my previous time watching, so I tried to approach it this time from a different angle, as a drama that had some bizarre absurdity to it which led to some uncomfortably funny moments. Viewed from that angle, I think it does some really interesting stuff. I think the central premise of a man being unknowingly put through a cloning procedure and having to deal with the consequences of this is so interesting, and they do a lot with it, exploring the dynamics and how things could go in this scenario. I love that they didn't leave any debate open about which was the clone, as this allowed for the second Miles' interaction with that knowledge to be explored. I also like that Kate wasn't kept in the dark about it the entire time, and they played around with that dynamic quite well. Possibly my biggest issue with the show is the fact that I found original Miles, Clone Miles and Kate to all be unlikable in their own ways, and I found it hard to root for them due to the decisions they made, although original Miles was by far the worst of the three. I also get why they spent a lot of time exploring the same events from different perspectives, and as a result did a lot of backtracking, but I found it slightly frustrating when I wanted to see the plot progress more. But overall I found it an interesting premise executed fairly well. I don't get what people don't like about Lightyear. Sure, this certainly isn't Pixar firing on all cylinders, but I found it a very enjoyable film. It was a fun comedy action film with an intriguing setup, slightly weird twist, but I get what they were going for. I think in general I would have preferred if the film had felt less like an animated film. Not that I wouldn't have wanted it to be animated, but I would have loved if outside being animated it had felt, in terms of plot and general tone, just like something like Star Wars. An action film that isn't explicitly meant for kids and is just trying to tell its own fun, sci-fi based story. I think they got some of the way there, with the actual crash and seeing the rebuilding feeling like something you would see in an actual live action sci-fi movie. I also loved the element that Buzz sees his best friend age and pass on over the space of presumably only a few months, and I think it was incredibly powerful. I also think the message itself was much more mature this time around. While Pixar messages can have very mature elements to them, I think they're usually very accessible to all ages, while Lightyear's message feels much less general and more specific to this world and the dilemma of whether it's right to change the past if it means erasing the future. That's a much purer philosophy question than the usual Pixar affair where the message is about life as we know it. I do think the goofier elements kind of let it down though, and without that it could have felt like something truly special. I also feel like it kind of undermines itself in terms of being canonically a film within the Toy Story universe. I feel like I'd be able to buy that a bit better if it didn't feel like an animated film, which again doesn't mean I didn't want it to be animated, but I feel like it should have felt like Andy was going to see a film like Star Wars and wanting to get a toy based on that, and instead it felt like he'd gone to see, I don't know, WALL-E. And while WALL-E is one of my favourite films of all time, what they've tried to set up here doesn't feel as strong because of it. I also think it was a massive missed opportunity for one of their 3 post-credit scenes not to be something taking place in the Toy Story universe. Maybe Buzz finally getting a chance to see the film he came from or something. Just a fun little interaction, but I guess that's a small thing really. Unpacking is a really chill game. Just like with Power Wash Simulator, it kind of takes something mundane and makes it enjoyable, and I can get behind that. When I first played it, I stopped because I couldn't work out where to put some of the stuff on one level, and I think that's my one big criticism of the game. Some of the objects aren't super clear as to what they actually are, and thus placing them can be tricky. I decided to pick it back up again when I was having a bit of a low day. It really did help me. It's just really chill, and seeing all the little details and Easter eggs is amazing. For example, there was the video games that you can place on shelves, but they're very clearly designed in their pixelated forms to look like actual video games, my favourite being The Simpsons Hit and Run. I also loved the detail that the main character still has her GameCube games and controllers after she got rid of her GameCube and bought a Wii, because a Wii was able to play GameCube games. There's a story told through the game, a simple one about growing up, moving to different homes, and eventually starting a family. There's a really cool detail in one of the levels where you move from what is clearly an apartment shared by a couple back to your childhood home, and there's a picture you can't pin up like all the other pictures and instead have to hide. A picture that shows 2 people together, hiding the photo of an ex after a breakup. Really clever use of storytelling without even any characters on screen. And then seeing the baby room in the final level is just so heartwarming. It might not seem it at first glance, but this is such a lovely game with a nice, if light, story that is worth putting time into. I actually watched the entirety of Bee and Puppy Cat on the same weekend that I played Unpacking, and it was a really great combo for a time I was feeling a bit delicate. This show is just really chill, but in an almost melancholic way. Just the kind of thing that I can dive into when I want to just wallow a bit and let it wash over me. It's weird and surreal, but I kind of like that, and I did have a few audible chuckles at certain points. The characters are all intriguing and likeable. Bee and Puppy Cat themselves obviously steal the show, and their interactions are always a joy. And I love how they implemented the Vocaloid as Puppy Cat's voice. It was so full of character all of the time. I did feel like I wasn't always clear on some of the details. And while yes, I am partially talking about the overarching plot and the lore behind what Puppy Cat, Bee and the island actually are, I'm also talking about just general details. For example, I didn't pick up on the fact that Deckard and Cass are meant to be siblings, nor did I realise that they live with all their other siblings, and I think that was because it wasn't communicated particularly well. There's a few things like that, which just feel like they could have been made a little clearer a little earlier, but the show is meant to be mostly about the vibes rather than the plot, and hell does it nail that. The art style is gorgeously, absolutely adorable, a treat to watch at every point. The music is so laid back and really adds to that sense of both relaxation and sadness. And the generally whimsical nature is brilliant. My favourite part has to be Cardamom though. I think there was something heartbreaking about his entire story. Him waking up and trying to look after his mum, wanting her to wake up and, in her absence, having to take on responsibilities no 7-year-old kid should ever have to. And once again, I feel like this hits me harder given my role as a teacher, as I'm very aware that young carers are a real thing and how difficult it can be for them, and the parallels here are very clear to me. Seeing him break down and ask why the adults aren't helping him, why they aren't acting like adults, and getting upset when the adults look towards him to solve the issues when he should never be the one doing that. Gosh, that's just heartbreaking. This show is definitely special, not just because I watched it at the exact time I needed it, but also because it's just plain fantastic, and I hope that there ends up being more of it. I actually finished this game on the same day as both Unpacking and Being Puppy Cat. I was on fire that day. This is essentially DS shovelware, and for once my wanting to buy it isn't because it's shovelware. No, when I was at university, one of my professors would often talk about a friend of his called Professor Heinz Wolf, and so me and my friends looked him up and found that he's actually a known figure, and he looks like a laugh to be honest. Then we found out he has a game on the DS and Wii, and when I saw it, I had to buy it. And so I purchased the DS version of Professor Heinz Wolf's Gravity. This was all the way back in, 2017, and I hadn't played it since then, but I figured now was as good a time as any. For what it's worth, the game isn't badly made. I mean, mostly. The physics work well enough, and the puzzles are mostly pretty solid and can get you thinking. It does at times feel like they just threw random things onto parts of the stage that won't be accessible for no good reason, but that's a small thing. There's also sometimes an over-reliance on making catapults. Many of the puzzles are fairly basic and don't take too much thought to complete, but some are a little more difficult and really feel satisfying to find the solution to. Unfortunately, there are also far too many which feel impossible and way too obtuse to solve, and that feeling doesn't fade away once you know the solution. How was I ever meant to guess how to do that? There is, thankfully, a hint system, and this is also the biggest complaint I have about the game because it's so stupid. You can spend points on hints for each puzzle, which will place an object for you. Each level has a different amount of hints, as well as the hints costing different amounts on different levels. This all sounds fair enough until you realise that you get a total of 500 points across the entire game. This is kinda stupid because once you're out of hints, that's you finished for the entire rest of the game. This is less of an issue when you consider that there's a fan-made guide online, but alas, this has an issue too, as it's a guide for the Wii version. The two versions are largely the same, other than the DS version being noticeably lesser in quality, obviously, and they mostly share the same levels. But there are some levels, for some reason, that are different, and if you hit on one of those on the DS version, well, that's too bad. Thankfully, I did manage to power through the ones I didn't have hint points or a guide for, and finished all 100 levels in the game. I'm fond of this game, not just because of the fact that it links to my days at uni, but also because, despite a weird hint system and some other generally weird decisions, why is there no reset level option? Why am I unable to undo more than one move? It's actually a fairly solid, if not stellar, physics puzzle game. Also, this game is officially the last video game for this challenge. The date is the 20th of October, so I finished quite early. Gives me time to catch up on some of the reading I need to do, I guess. I don't really think The Gentlemen left much of an impression on me, honestly. I enjoyed it well enough, I just don't really know how I should feel about it. It was witty, but not hilarious. I loved the Britishness of it all, but I also feel like I could see that in many other things. It was a relatively intriguing show about the drug business, but was no Breaking Bad. Overall, it was just kind of what it was. Very few of the scenes or characters or jokes are likely to stick with me, but I wasn't bored by them at all. Would I have finished it if I hadn't been doing this challenge? Yeah, I think so. Am I going to watch the second season when it releases? Probably not. I don't feel like I have anything overwhelmingly good or bad to say about it. It doesn't really invoke any strong emotions in me, but that doesn't mean it was boring or difficult to get through. It was a mildly enjoyable watch and I don't regret it. It's just kinda alright. Okay, so yes, this is the third Philip Reeve book I've read for this challenge. Frankly, had I known a new Mortal Engines book was being written, I probably wouldn't have bothered with Utterly Dark, but as it is, I wasn't going to avoid reading the new book in one of my all-time favourite series just because of the challenge. It's probably been over a decade since I read a Mortal Engines book, but I do remember that the first was my favourite, and I like the prequel trilogy significantly less than the rest of the books. As Thunder City is a prequel, although a less distant prequel, I didn't have particularly high hopes. I think Thunder City is excellent, possibly my favourite in the series besides the very first book. The original book's cast of characters were what made it special, and while being set 100 years before those books means that those characters can't be used, a lot of effort was put into making the new cast just as lovable. Tamsin doesn't seem like a particularly standout character at first, but I loved seeing how she grew throughout the book, and I think the idea of a character who is, in a way, a killing machine, but is also completely unable to kill people is really interesting. I also think her entire backstory and how it was affected by the death of Eve Vespertine was perfectly handled. Max and Trubshaw are serviceable, but I found Oddington Doom to be a very likeable and charismatic presence. And good old Hilly Torbenhau was absolutely my favourite character. She's characterised exactly as you would expect a middle-aged history tutor to be characterised, even while she's pulling off heists and jailbreaks, and rarely seems more than a little flustered. She's brilliant. I do think Strager was a bit undercooked as a villain, as we don't spend much time with him, but that's small potatoes. I also think the focus on stalkers, or revenants as they're mostly referred to in this book, was pretty cool, especially with all the animal-based revenants with interesting abilities. I feel like many people would have been expecting at least a cameo from Shrike, the stalker most prominently featured in the series, but I don't think he really fits anywhere here, and forcing him in for no reason wouldn't benefit the book at all. What we got here in Vespertine was absolutely better. I was originally thinking that Tamsin herself would end up being turned into a revenant, but making Eve Vespertine into one instead to embody Tamsin's guilt is so much better. And while she's only around for the latter section of the book, she's a very lovable character, especially with how she cares for Small Cat the Small Cat. More than anything though, this book reminded me of just how much I love this world. Remember what I said about Breathe and how it would be easy to replace the hypothetical of what if there wasn't enough oxygen with any manner of other hypotheticals and get a very similar result? Yeah, try doing that with the idea of cities that move around and eat other cities. It's such a fascinating concept, and tied so inherently to the plot as well that it makes this world feel unique and important. I love the little glimpses of the modern world through the lens of the far future, like people using CDs as decorations, or the fact that an airborne city has hotel rooms that are suspended in the sky with balloons. These are, of course, called Airbnbs. The world building is ingenious and had me hooked throughout almost as much as the characters. It makes me really happy that we got another look into this world, and I hope it won't be the last if this is the kind of quality we can expect. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm notorious for the fact that I just haven't seen most of the films that people would say that anyone has to have seen, but the one area of exception to this would be animated films. I've seen almost every animated Disney and Pixar film, most of DreamWorks' library, and many others besides. I enjoy animated films, so I tend to be drawn to them more than other types of film. With that said, there are some notable exceptions, Coraline being one of them. I don't know why, I've just never felt the compulsion to watch it, despite knowing it's meant to be fantastic. I also wasn't aware that it was an adaptation of a book, and even if I did know that, I would never have guessed that Neil Gaiman would be the person behind it. I haven't read any of his books before, nor really seen any of the adaptations of them, besides Stardust, which, again, I didn't know was him. But I hear his name a lot, and I know that he's very highly considered. Coraline is a weird story, and that's clearly entirely by design. It tells of a girl who's bored and unsatisfied with life and ends up finding her way to a different version of her own home, with weird, twisted versions of her parents and the people around her, and has to try and escape the clutches of her other mother. It's creative in its creepiness and always keeps itself interesting. Seeing how the other mother twists everything, distorting it from what it's meant to be, is 2 parts of delight and 1 part horrifying, probably the standout for me being the fate of the other father. I also felt like there were some really clever pieces of setup. The snow globe was telegraphed way too obviously, but I could never have guessed how Chekhov's well was going to play into the story, and the other mother's hand being cut off was so subtle that even when I realised what had happened, it didn't even occur to me it would play into anything later on. Coraline herself is a bit of an enigma to me. The way she reacts to things often feels off, and I feel like she herself contributes as much to the feeling of eeriness as any of the weird, twisted creatures of the other mother's domain. It also occurred to me that she feels somewhat neurodiverse coded, but I don't know if that's just me reading too much into the unusual way she sometimes responds to things. Either way, I think she and the book about her are deeply intriguing. The story goes that when ADV were approached about making a dub about ghost stories, they were given basically no guidance or limitations, other than keeping the character names and the way the ghosts were defeated each episode the same. Now, when you give someone these very basic instructions and say that they can do whatever the hell else they want with it, they aren't going to take it seriously, and so the dub we got of this anime is full of pop culture references, meta jokes, fourth wall breaks, ad-libs, and the odd offensive joke or seven. This is known for feeling more like an abridged parody than an official dub, and while I haven't seen many abridged parodies, I have to agree. The pop culture references date it a bit, but it isn't too big an issue. It's also interesting seeing the new characterizations and trying to figure out what the characters were like before this weird dub came about. Momoko obviously wouldn't be a hardcore evangelical Christian constantly spouting Bible verses and talking about sin. Kenshiro would have had actual dialogue in the places where it's basically just unintelligible crying, and I doubt Hajime was quite as big a pervert. Although I do get the impression that this wasn't entirely invented by the dub. Amana Jaku is the one character I could imagine was fairly similar between the dub and the original, as the sarcastic demon just fits what the dub was doing naturally anyway. I will say there are way more racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-Semitic and ableist jokes than I cared to enjoy. They're mostly fairly self-aware about it, but it was the mid-2000s, so it definitely feels a little uncomfortable at times. I will say that the dub kinda suffers from the fact that modern anime is much more self-aware, and so some of these jokes that would have been shocking at the time are less so now, but it still takes it much further than you would expect. But overall, I think the key thing that makes it work is just that it's really funny. Not every joke lands, but it throws enough at the wall that plenty of it sticks. And looking through the dub and trying to consider what the original must be like, I can only imagine it would be very generic and uninteresting. And so this bizarre dub may be the one thing making ghost stories actually worth consideration at all. A Man Called Otto, if you try to explain it to someone, could be summed up as a man tries to kill himself, but every time he tries, something inconvenient happens which stops him. You could explain it that way. There are other ways you could explain it though, because the reality is that it isn't about the process of killing oneself. It isn't even about wanting to kill oneself. A Man Called Otto is about the reasons to live. Otto is a crotchety old man, someone who has lost his wife and thus feels he has lost his reason to live. The reality is he'd just become closed off to all the good things. The film is an emotional rollercoaster. It balances the darkness of the suicide attempts with the heartwarming way that Otto begrudgingly, but not really, gets roped into helping his neighbours and friends. I do love the detail that every time he's about to try and kill himself, the reason he's interrupted is because he tries to help someone. It shows the true nature of the man, the nature he doesn't want to show but cannot help letting out. He still cares about making the community a better place, even if he has a volatile way of going about it. He does care about living, he just doesn't quite realise it. Otto himself is the star of the show, but Marisol is my personal favourite character. She's very sweet, but it's very obvious that she'll put Otto in his place if needs be, and that's exactly what he needs. In fact, Marisol's presence in his life is what sets off the chain of events that saved him, not just because his first suicide attempt was interrupted by her and her husband moving in, but also because she let him be more open to the idea that people are worth a shot. Without her, he wouldn't have taken in the cat, which is what makes him put his attempts on pause, and because of how much he learned from their friendship, he was able to open himself up to getting to know Malcolm and rebuilding the bridge with Reuben. The ending is bittersweet, and I think most of the bitter for me comes from the realization that he was only a part of Marisol and her family's life, and having his new, more positive outlook on life for about a year. But that's life. It doesn't always end with a long, healthy one, but he was able to live some of his life with that newfound love, and that's what matters. Yeah, this one had me quite emotional, I'll have to admit. I love to discover cartoons that are clearly made to be kid appropriate, but not dumbed down for them. Things that come to mind are Phineas and Ferb, Gravity Falls, Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts, and The Hollow. When I first watched the pilot of The Last Kids on Earth a few years ago now, I was hoping for something on that level, but while it felt like it had promise, it also at times felt a little too... is juvenile the right word? Either way, I never ended up watching past that pilot, but I always intended to, and that's where this challenge came into it. So I watched the whole thing, and I think my opinion is largely the same. If I were to try and sum up what kinds of shows it felt like to me, think Gravity Falls mixed with Johnny Test. It can, a lot of the time, be quite a witty show, and also has some pretty dark themes and delves into some pretty cosmic stuff for its lore, but never quite as much as Gravity Falls. And it also does have that much goofier style of comedy embedded into it, seeming to try and be a cool show for nerds to watch, but doesn't lean on that as hard as Johnny Test. I think in the end, it feels more than just another generic cartoon, but certainly not one of the greats. I thought the characters were mostly enjoyable, although Jack is kinda insufferable a lot of the time, seeing as he's made to face the fact that his obsession with not wanting to lose his friends is his biggest weakness multiple times, and never seems to learn from it. On the other hand, I thought Dirk was a great character, especially as, while he does somewhat fit the meathead stereotype, he isn't portrayed as outright stupid, and is often the straight man for everyone else, which I thought was a great way to handle that character. I also think that the overarching plot had some really interesting parts, and any time the kids were actually made to face the reality that actually, yeah, this is the end of the world, I thought it was excellent. The insecurity and melancholy made a very nice contrast with the hijinks and shenanigans. I do think some things felt a little weird. I'm very glad the feat complete element was mostly contained within the pilot, but overall it was enjoyable. It does suck that it was cancelled though, as it was left on a cliffhanger, and I think there was a lot more potential here. If you don't know who Richard Osman is, then frankly, you can't be British, because he is one of our most prominent and beloved TV personalities. Starting out as a co-host of popular quiz show Pointless, he eventually got his own game show, House of Games, which is also brilliant, and he's been a common face on our TVs for probably over a decade and a half now. But that isn't all he's done, as he also wrote his own series of murder mystery books called The Thursday Murder Club. Sometimes I just know I'm going to love a book before I've started to read it. Maybe here it was knowing Richard Osman's TV personality and how that could translate into a book. Maybe the premise itself sounded brilliant. Either way, I knew it would be my kind of thing. The Thursday Murder Club is about a group of old age pensioners in a retirement village who spend their Thursdays looking through old police files to solve unsolved murders. But when a murder lands a little closer to home, they decide to take it upon themselves to investigate who did it. This book had me hooked from very early on for so many reasons. Firstly, the characters are great. The club itself is made up of Ron, Ibrahim, Elizabeth and Joyce, the latter two being the best characters. Elizabeth is the de facto leader and is a force of nature, not only being incredibly intelligent, but also resourceful and seeming to intimidate pretty much everyone around her. Joyce, meanwhile, is clearly the heart of the group. Everyone likes her and she seems to make everyone's day better when she's around, and this seems to be a crucial part of the club making the progress they do, as it's how they are able to connect with so many people. Ron and Ibrahim are also great, and I loved the dynamic that Chris and Donna had with each other, and by extension with the Thursday Murder Club. I was actually really worried that it was gearing up to Chris and Donna being romantically involved, despite Chris being explicitly much older than Donna, so I was actually delighted at the fact that it was actually Donna's mum that Chris was paired up with unexpectedly at the end. And that's one of the great things about this book. It has so much misdirection, but all masterfully handled. The chapter where it seems Elizabeth is getting a confession out of Father Mackey, but it's actually revealed that she's giving a fake confession to try and get info out of him was awesome. And heck, there's even even a point where it seems it's gearing up to point the finger at Joyce, and I actually believe that that was where they were going to go for a second. I think what makes it work too is the fact that people do have secrets, even if the secrets aren't the ones that pertain specifically to the murders. And each unravelling of secrets feels satisfying and worth the journey, especially bringing the entire thing full circle by making Penny the start of the killing cycle, as well as it being related to the case discussed in the very first chapter. The book is funny and so incredibly British in a way I cannot get enough of. But beyond all this, beyond the mysteries, the humour, the lovable grannies and the cosy feeling, is something much more melancholic. This is, after all, set primarily in a retirement home, a place where old people go in the last throes of their life, and that is absolutely a theme throughout the book. Death and illness, as well as the ideas of losing one's autonomy, their freedom, even their mind, are all explored, and the inevitability of death is always a looming threat in this place that many of the characters reflect on, and yet, in the end, the Thursday Murder Club are living life. Their lives are full of fun, friendship and excitement. It's proof that being closer to death than birth doesn't mean that life has to stop, and I think that's seriously beautiful. This book is not as special to me as Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, but damn if it isn't one of the best books I've ever read. When I've watched a film for the first time, I often go onto the Cinema Wins YouTube channel to see if he's done an episode on it. I used to do the same with CinemaSins as well, but despite the fact that I'm less critical of CinemaSins than most people, I just kinda got bored of those videos. But watching videos that point out all the cool details and talk about films in an almost entirely positive light is not only very enjoyable, but it can also give me a new appreciation for a film that I didn't initially really get. And I'd say that with No, I didn't entirely get it at first. Don't get me wrong, I liked bits of it. I thought it did incredibly well at building suspense, and I enjoyed M and OJ as characters. I also liked the idea of a horror film with an absolutely enormous monster, and it still maintained that same fear. I thought Jean Jacket was a really cool concept for an alien, and especially loved the fully revealed form. And I also thought that the fact it was an animal and acted like one was really cool. Oh, and the third act was undeniably cool as heck, but it didn't have me fully convinced. I didn't always get what was going on or what was being suggested, and at times the film looked too dark to me to the point that I didn't really understand what was happening. I also just didn't get why the gaudy stuff was there. Like, I got it, as it did relate to the animal element of Jean Jacket, but it felt too loosely connected, and while interesting in its own light, it often just felt weird to randomly flash back to that when there were other things going on. I would say these are largely fair comments that can still hold weight, as with no outside influence, that's how I experienced Nope. But that's often why I watch Cinema Wins videos. It gives me a much greater appreciation for the film. I get why the gaudy stuff is there, and I have a bit more clarity on the things I didn't get. I now have a largely positive outlook on the film, and I find it really intriguing, as many other people have. I still feel like it's a knock against the film that I wasn't able to get it quite as much as I wanted to the first time around, but that's most likely just a me thing, and I'm glad that I can view it much more from a standpoint of appreciation rather than confusion. The IT Crowd is one of the classic British comedies from the 2000s, and if nothing else, it has made the phrase, "have you tried turning it off and on again," incredibly popular. As such, I have seen bits of it before, and as it happens, this is the 12th and final show I'll be watching that I have watched before. The question is, what did I think of it? I thought it was good, but not great. Don't get me wrong, it's funny, the casts were each quirky in their own way and are enjoyable enough. Maybe it's because I've seen some absolutely stellar comedies in the past, but I didn't really feel like it was anything special. Which, again, isn't to say it's bad, it's just a solid comedy, and I guess it doesn't have to be anything more than that. I'd happily watch more if it ever came back, but I'm not exactly gasping for it like I am for, say, the Community movie. I wanted for this challenge to read a book I knew literally nothing about. Most of the other books I've had some inkling about, either from a blurb, having some prior knowledge, knowing the series or author already, or even just a vibe. I knew literally nothing about the Bookseller of Kabul. I knew nothing about the author, I decided not to read the blurb, I didn't know the subject matter except it involved a bookseller and Kabul, and if I may confess, I didn't even know where Kabul is because my geography is shocking and I can never remember cities and what countries they belong to. The book is a deeply intriguing look into Afghani life, not just the culture of the country, but also the struggles the people have. And as a bonus, it was written not even a year after 9/11, and you get to see the impacts of this directly. I have a lot of friends from different cultures, and I have to say that I love finding out more about those cultures, so I was rather engrossed. But there was an uneasiness to the experience, as this is very much a warts and all kind of deal. You see it all. The blatant misogyny baked into the patriarchal society is kinda obvious, and the effects of war were not pleasant to see, but there are even deeper places the book dives. In particular, seeing how the females are constantly having their hopes and dreams shattered, especially with Layla in the last chapter, is awful, and seeing them have to just make do with the best their families will allow, I don't know, it feels inhumane. And I do know that arranged marriage isn't always like it's presented here, as I do have friends who have been through that process and are happy, but seeing what was presented here, it just feels so wrong. That isn't the worst of it, as it's made particularly clear that minors are regularly preyed upon. The eponymous bookseller takes his second bride when she is only 16, and another man in the story is dead set on marrying a 13-year-old girl he claims he has fallen in love with, based on, what, love at first sight? And there was even worse that I frankly can't even stomach to bring up here. Things that made me so glad that this is a fictional work. It was very soon after that thought occurred to me that I found out that this is not a fictional work. As horrifying a realization as that was, it did make me even more invested in the book. Part of this is probably because if taken as a novel, it's kinda lacking due to not having much structure as a story. Taken in a more anthological manner, it is much more compelling. But I also think it's because while not written by an Afghani, it does feel like a true window into a culture that is alien to me. And I do have to remind myself that I have a very Western view of the world, but I don't think anyone could say anything that would convince me that what these women have to go through isn't wrong. Layla stood out to me as an especially strong character, and one I was really rooting for in the end, and that it didn't work out well for her is heartbreaking, especially with the context that she is not, indeed, a character at all. I do wonder what has happened to the family past what was detailed in the epilogue. I will say that I was much more interested in the personal stories rather than the political details, although maybe that's just a me thing. But I found this book deeply fascinating, and I'm glad I read it to gain a new perspective on a culture I never knew that much about before. Stop motion is easily one of the most creative forms of animation, and as someone who enjoys the odd Wallace and Gromit film, as well as Wes Anderson's other popular stop motion film, Fantastic Mr. Fox, Isle of Dogs has been on my radar for a while. I just never ended up watching it, but given I have the time, the means, and frankly the excuse, why not knock it off my list? And it's so clear to see how stylistically similar it is to Fantastic Mr. Fox in many ways, and all the ways I enjoyed that film for. To sum it up, the film feels bizarre, and of course I'm saying that as a positive. It's a fun bizarreness. The decision to not have subtitles for Japanese characters was very interesting. Actually, Disney Plus automatically put subtitles on for me when I started the movie, which I immediately turned off as it was subtitling all of the sounds as well, which would have been distracting. Overall, I don't feel the subtitles are necessary, as it's never unclear what's happening or what's being said, but I also don't know if it really added as much to the film as was intended. The idea, from what I can tell, was that the lack of translation for the Japanese characters would allow you to feel more like you're seeing it from the perspective of the dog, with dogs and humans not understanding each other's language. Except there were also several English-speaking human characters, which undermines that idea for me, and more so when it seems that Atari is fully capable of understanding what the dogs say. This is a small deal though, and otherwise, the film was stylistically immaculate, visually intriguing, and had a really solid story throughout that I was engaged in. And it had dogs, so who am I to complain? Baby Reindeer is intense. It has some humorous elements and some much needed moments of levity, but the entire thing feels like a pressure cooker, with the growing scale of the situation becoming, at times, unbearable. But it was also incredibly gripping, and despite my plan only being to watch the first episode one day, I ended up being so engrossed in it that I binged the whole thing that same day. I think one of the things that made me so hooked on it was the slow realization that this show isn't really about Martha and her stalking. I mean, it is, but Martha, while significant, isn't the inciting incident of the story, as that would be everything involving Darius. Donnie was already spiraling well before Martha came into the picture, and she just changed the dynamic and allowed Donnie to interact with that spiral in new ways. The fact that Donnie is presented in the first episode as pretty unextraordinary is kinda genius. The only real thing that stands out about him is the fact that he lives with his ex's mother, but I found that I was able to relate to him in how the Martha situation started. The peer pressure, as well as the desire to help what he saw as a poor, hurt woman feel like they would combine to create a situation where a lot of people may do the same thing in pitying Martha and trying not to make too big a deal of things as they escalated. But by the end, it was clear that this wasn't all exactly as it seemed in the beginning. That Donnie's actions were actually stemmed in a deep pit of trauma and an identity crisis. In the end, I think I expected that Martha would be the most interesting character study in the show, but no, it was definitely Donnie. I found the exploration into him fascinating, as well as rather unsettling. This is, after all, based on a true story, and while how true it is has apparently been questioned, I feel the internal reflections present in this show are as true as anything can be. I also found the way the amateur comedy circuit was presented fascinating. I've never been a comedian of any sort, shocking, I know, but I have watched amateur and semi-amateur comedy for a few years now, and I think it's interesting to see that often the crowd is the most important factor. Sometimes a joke will land on one night and not on others, and it can be entirely dependent on the crowd. And sometimes it takes one moment, an unexpected moment, to take a crowd from unimpressed to laughing their hats off, even if the quality and type of comedy hasn't changed. It's all about the energy that the crowd has, and how a low energy crowd can be charged with that energy. I found it cool to see this kind of dynamic represented in the stand-up bits of the show, as it's something I've seen firsthand and it can be brutal. A Clockwork Orange should be an intriguing story about delinquency, free will, and living with the consequences of one's actions. It should be a thought-provoking study of government and the unethical methods they employ. It should be. And it is indeed a story about delinquency, free will, and living with the consequences of one's actions, and it is a study of governments and the unethical methods they employ. What it isn't is intriguing or thought-provoking. And maybe that's a bit harsh, but I'm gonna be honest, this book was a chore. I think the use of slang in the book can be really effective in capturing the nuances of a society, be that real life slang or slang made up for a fictional time period. That's all well and good. But usually that's done in such a way as to not be overwhelming, and it's usually easy enough to figure out what it means. When every fifth word feels like I have to take a trip to Bletchley Park, that's an issue. Granted, Bletchley Park isn't that far away from me, but that's not the point. I still don't really know what Vec means, or Yarbles, or Ludies. Sure, I could probably figure it out, I have my suspicions, but with so many words to have to remember, I just ended up glazing over most of these and just tried to get most of the context from the rest of the text. As I say, it was a chore, actually exhausting to read. I thought it was cool in that it showed the real difference between the generations or maturity gaps, and Pete speaking normally in the last chapter was an okay payoff to it. Plus it does feel kinda relevant when I'm constantly hearing my students spouting skibbity riz sigma and so forth, but it was so exaggerated to the point of feeling goofy and unbearable to actually have to read through. And the one thought that always came back to me was this: if you wrote this story without as much of the slang, heck, not even eliminating it, just toning it down significantly, I think you would end up with a better novel. I don't think what has been done here is clever. I think it's a poor writing choice which overshadows anything the book was trying to say, and anything the slang was meant to be conveying thematically could quite simply have been conveyed in much more meaningful and intelligible ways. I want to give this book props for some of the interesting stuff it did, but frankly I don't really much of that sticking with me. You thought I was done with video games? Ha! No, I can find video games in all sorts of media, and that includes films. As I've already seen Wreck-It Ralph, as well as movies based on games I'm already interested in like Mario, Ratchet & Clank and Professor Layton, I have to look next to the other big crossover video game movie of the 2010s, Pixels. And right off the bat, the film never really stood a chance for anyone who has seen Wreck-It Ralph because that film clears in basically every way. I'll give it credit to start. I do like that it's mostly very focused on arcade games rather than video games in general. It made sense for Wreck-It Ralph to be much more focused on wider gaming, as it does take place in a modern day arcade, but the Pixel setup means that focusing exclusively on games that released in the earlier days of arcades makes sense, and I think it's a cool direction to go in. I loved seeing some lesser known arcade classics get some love, and I was unsure about the decision to not give Space Invaders any sort of spotlight in a film about invaders from space, but Gallagher was a much more natural fit in the end, and Space Invaders were still in the final battle, so that was good. I also loved that the Mario sprite used was his arcade sprite. They could have copped out and gone for his most iconic look, but they didn't. With that said, I have some criticisms. Some of the games featured were definitely not around in 1982, when the probe was supposedly sent into space. Not a massive deal, sure, but this is a film for nerds who are going to overanalyze anything, so those things really do get in the way a bit. Not just that, but some of the games used were most certainly not arcade games. Sure, there was an arcade version of Tetris, but that was much later than 1982, and heck, even the original Tetris was a 1985 game, so it makes no sense to be here. And don't get me started on the Duck Hunt Dog being there, although to be fair, I did get a kick out of that just because I love the Duck Hunt Dog. But it just feels weird to include these things when the entire point of the film seems to be celebrating arcade games specifically. I feel like it would have been cool to focus entirely on actual arcade games. And also, why was Lady Lisa created? They seriously couldn't find some actual hot woman from an arcade game to use? Just feels a bit weird. I also feel, and this may be nitpicking, that Pac-Man would have been so much better as the climax. Sure, Donkey Kong is one of the arcade greats, but Pac-Man is the arcade great, so thematically it would have made more sense. But also, I think a car chase through New York is a much more climactic scene than literally just Donkey Kong in a black void, and I think it was easily the best scene of the film too. Quite well done overall. Everything else about the plot could easily have been worked around. Beyond all that, the film just isn't great. It feels very much like an awkward comedy that acts as wish fulfillment for Adam Sandler, where him being a nerd is somehow not only crucial to him saving the world, but also being irresistible to the main love interest. It's a nerd's fantasy, sure, but it just feels way too hyperbolic and unrealistic to be satisfying. Not that I was expecting realistic in a film about aliens sending arcade games to conquer Earth, but still, the comedy, the character interactions, none of it felt quite right, and it did just come across as Adam Sandler worship, which, I mean, I don't know. Adam Sandler worship feels like it would be a very disappointing religion. Overall, I didn't enjoy this film. Not really. But I can appreciate some of what it tried to do in paying respects to arcade games, even if I think they fumbled it even on that front. This is a rare case of a movie I have actually started watching before, but never finished. I was interested in it from the very first trailer I saw of it, as it seemed quirky, interesting and funny, so I watched the first 10 minutes or so one day last year while I was eating breakfast, always intended to watch the rest, but never did. As I said before, I kinda need to sit down and watch a movie the whole way through in one sitting, but I figured I might as well give it another go now that I have a reason to. Rye Lane made me laugh out loud way more than I expected. I think a lot of that comes from Yaz. The way she interacts with people is endlessly entertaining, especially seeing how other people react to her. Her dynamic with Dom was the star of the show though. After all, the majority of the film is them just walking around chatting, and without the chemistry it wouldn't have worked at all. I loved the hijinks they got up to, and seeing Yaz bring Dom out of his shell and give him new and bizarre experiences was wonderful. The film also feels like it has a unique and engaging style and really shows off a side of London I've always loved. There isn't much more to say here. It's a great watch and I'm glad I decided to return to it. I hadn't heard about the Netflix series of The Three Body Problem before my friend mentioned the book to me. She'd been interested in Chinese literature and had been talking to me about the book and how much the adaptation had seemed to change, and I found that interesting as someone who dislikes adaptations making massive sweeping changes to whatever it is adapting. This was in around March or April, and I hadn't necessarily had a massive interest in actually reading the book. But when I went to a nearby Waterstones and saw it there, I figured I might as well give it a go. I mean, at that point, I already had the Thursday Murder Club, A Clockwork Orange and Coraline in my arms. I might as well add another one to the pile, right? A lot of media I have consumed this year has been through either recommendation or from people giving it to me. Most of those I've enjoyed, and so it doesn't feel like just a novelty to read a book that a friend suggested to me, and The Three Body Problem is no exception to this. The book is an experience to be sure, delving into deep philosophical and scientific topics without pulling any punches and dragging you along for the ride, and it works. There were times when the science and sometimes the historical and political angles were a bit much, and I found myself myself getting a bit lost and confused or just uninterested, but that was not the majority of my experience with it. I found most of it incredibly interesting, especially the exploration of the three-body problem itself. I loved everything that happened in the three-body game, and the way the layers of mystery were peeled back was excellent. Actually, that could be said as well for the existence of aliens. I was only vaguely aware that this was a proper sci-fi novel, so I was actually discovering whether aliens were possible along with the characters, and that was great. The book has a certain level of existential dread, going on cosmic horror, which also kept me gripped throughout, but I loved that the penultimate chapter emphasises a more hopeful note, and that it isn't entirely cynical. I think the biggest area of issue for me is the characters. I initially found Yi Wenji to be a compelling protagonist, and Wang Miao was fine, but I never found him as intriguing, so that switch early on threw me a bit. But beyond that, I felt like a lot of the time things just kinda happened. Wang Miao would stop playing the game and someone would just happen to call him, or he would visit someone and they would suggest that he should go and see someone else for seemingly no reason. I wasn't entirely clear, for example, why he'd go to visit the mother of someone he'd barely ever interacted with. I get that there was more going on, but the pretense just felt really flimsy and that kind of stuff bothered me. That said, it wasn't all bad for me. I found Dashi to be a fun character, and Yi Wenji's reveal as essentially the primary antagonist of the story was such a shock to me, and yet kinda perfect. She was my standout character for sure, and everything to do with her had me hooked. I've been told that the following books are even less character focused, which I find a little worrying because I already wasn't sure about this book's character focus, but I enjoyed the three-body problem more than enough to want to read the rest. And hey, maybe I'll watch the series for comparison's sake too. I've always been more of a Pixar guy than a DreamWorks guy, but that doesn't at all mean I don't have a lot of love for some DreamWorks films. I've always loved the Shrek movies, Shrek 2 especially, and Megamind, The Bad Guys and The Wild Robot are all fantastic in their own rights. So with Puss in Boots: The Last Wish getting so much buzz, I did want to see it closer to when it released. I just never got around to it. But when I saw it was on Netflix, I put it on immediately. And yeah, it's every bit as great as people say it is. The style is impeccable, especially in fight scenes. The camera angles, exaggeration, use of colour and low frame rate on some shots all combine to make something that is a visual treat. I never got bored of it. But beyond the surface level, there was a lot great here to do with the story. Puss running from death was incredibly well done, and the final fight between the two of them was excellent, not even ruined at all by the fact that I had seen it in full on Twitter previously. My favourite part of the film was Goldilocks and the Three Bears though, an element I've never really seen people talk about. I loved the family dynamic. At first Goldilocks seems like she just rules over them, but in the end it's more that she's just the most pragmatic of the four of them, and the genuine love between them is really touching. Seeing her get to realise that they were all the family she ever needed was lovely. I also love that there was a greater link to the Shrek films than the first film. Pinocchio and the Gingerbread Man both made cameos, and there was a hint towards them going to Far, Far Away at the end. I was always genuinely unsure whether or not the first film was meant to be a prequel to the Shrek films or not, as nothing about Shrek was ever mentioned or hinted at, and it seemed to take place in a completely different place. This film didn't have that issue. I also found it interesting that they actually acknowledged the existence of fairy tales and nursery rhymes in this film, which is an intriguing idea. So yeah, overall, all you've heard about this one is true. It's really that great. When I decided to buy They Both Die at the End, I figured it would be a coin flip on whether it would be a deeply intriguing exploration of an incredibly intriguing idea, or a really cringe romance novel that was just not my kind of thing. I can confirm the coin landed on heads and I absolutely loved it. The general premise is that in the near future, somehow, they have found a way to know if a person will die on any given day, and they will be alerted on that day to let them know so they can live their last day to its fullest, say goodbye to those they loved, all that kind of stuff. I think there are many comparisons I would be remiss not to make between this book and Breathe, because the parallels and how this book does it so much better are stunning. Firstly, I mentioned in my review of that book that it felt like the premise wasn't that interesting and felt like it could have been interchangeable with pretty much anything. They Both Die at the End doesn't have that issue. The world is fleshed out an incredible amount, and the concept of what if you knew for certain you were gonna die on the day it would happen is not only incredibly unique, but it informs every single step of the journey. Everything about what Rufus and Mateo do is informed by the fact that they know they will die. And it isn't just world building, but also how it fundamentally impacts the characters, how it exposes them, and how it allows them to grow. I honestly can't do it justice in my words. This alone makes it an intriguing read, but it also shares with Breathe the fact that it has a first-person perspective split chapter by chapter between Rufus and Matteo. My two biggest issues with this in Breathe were the fact that the characters didn't feel like they had unique enough narrative voices for it to be worth doing that rather than just having it be in third person, and the fact that it stuck super rigidly to following the perspective of the three main characters. Neither of these issues exist in They Both Die at the End. Rufus's narrative voice is very different to Matteo's, with him often using some of the words or phrases he uses in his actual speech, and sometimes a chapter will take the perspective of other characters, sometimes of one of Rufus or Matteo's loved ones, or sometimes of a character that isn't related to the main plot, but is affected by it or has a different perspective on it. These chapters were often short, but I loved them. Rufus and Matteo are both great characters, and seeing them both grow is wonderful. And their romance felt natural. I wasn't convinced that it would get there at first, especially with Rufus's story starting with him not being over Amy, but as the book progresses, it just feels right that it should go that direction. The adventure through the book is brilliant, but tinged with so much sadness because you know what's going to happen in the end, and you know there's no way to escape it. It's a tragic but beautiful story that reminded me that I have to try and live my life to the fullest. We all do. Hallmark movies. We all know them, we all love them. One of those things is a lie. Okay, to be fair, I actually give Hallmark movies a lot of slack because, in reality, they achieve exactly what they set out to do. They are basic, formulaic films that rely on Christmas vibes and general holiday spirit to give that warm, fuzzy feeling inside during the month of December. These films are not meant to be masterpieces, and I think it'd miss the point if they were. They're best enjoyed in the background while you're doing family board game night next to the fire, or, in my case, wrapping all my presents. And I had a fair few presents to wrap, so I decided to stick a Hallmark movie on to keep my mind company. And you know what? It did everything I expected and hoped it would, so I can't really criticise this film too hard. Okay, yeah, I can. As is to be expected, this is a film full of cliches, corny acting, nonsensical character decisions, and coincidences that are passed off as the lamest Christmas miracles ever. The idea behind the film is that after being broken up with in the holiday period, a woman whose name I've already forgotten decides to send 5 Christmas cards that she was going to send to her Ebenezer of a boyfriend throughout the Christmas period, instead to the 5 most important people in her life. These are her aunt, her brother, her best friend, her music teacher from when she was 7, and a guy in a boy band she was into. This is kind of depressing the more you think about it. The letters barely have any relevance to the plot itself, not really. They do each act as a spark that changes something for the person who received it, but it feels like the namesake of this film is just forgotten for most of the runtime. Each of the stories playing out also feels almost entirely separate from the others, and any convergence towards the end is kinda minimal. Oh, and the main character wanting to not acknowledge Christmas is also supposed to be a plot point, but it's easy to forget that when she's going shopping for Christmas trees, pretending to be Santa's wife, constantly quoting It's a Wonderful Life, and, sending Christmas cards to her nearest and dearest. And a guy in a boy band. That really is depressing. Oh, and top tip to anyone making a corny Christmas movie, it may be best to avoid drawing attention to one of the greatest Christmas films of all time, because all it will do is make people want to watch that film instead. The film is full of all the cliches you would expect, such as the boyfriend who hates Christmas but is dating a Christmas obsessive, a cute Christmas dog, old people falling in love, young people falling in love but insisting they aren't for way longer than is reasonable, buying hot chocolate, dead parents, yes that is a surprisingly common trope in Hallmark movies, and so on and so forth. I'm glad I didn't play a drinking game with this one, or else my presents would have been wrapped way worse than they already were. But sure, I can throw around all these criticisms, but does any of it really matter? It's not meant to be a masterpiece, it's just meant to be a cute thing to put on in the background, and it's managed to be that. And it did give me that warm fuzzy feeling. What more can I ask for? I've rarely really watched any anime as it's releasing. I watched the first season of Beastars a few weeks after it was released, and I always watched the newest season of Agretsuko whenever it was out, but experiencing an anime as it's releasing for the first time is a rarity for me. I've watched a bit of anime this year, but I'm by no means the biggest fan of the medium. I enjoy some, but I also enjoy a lot of Western animation and live action stuff. But Dandadan was getting some buzz, and I only had one more show to watch for this challenge, so I figured I'd give this one a go, see what all the buzz was about, and the buzz was absolutely justified. The style is the first thing to hit you, especially during the opening credits, which, fun fact, are the only credits I never skipped this year. But even beyond that, there's an exaggeration to all the characters' actions that draws me in. This also goes for the fight scenes, which are so cool. I especially love Okarune's transformation, and how that contributes to the fight scenes. I love the merging of the supernatural and the extraterrestrial, although I feel it's somewhat a missed opportunity for Momo's powers not to be somehow linked to aliens. It would feel thematically relevant for Okarune to have been a skeptic about ghosts, but for his powers to have come from one, and Momo to have been a skeptic about aliens, but for her powers to come from them. The characters overall feel fresh and interesting, although Momo and Okarune are the clear standout, especially their bond. I love that often what seems to be building to an intimate moment is often just undercut by one or the other reacting in a volatile way to something petty, but that there's still very clear growing fondness between them. There are also some amazing emotional moments, even outside that pairing, especially the episode exploring the backstory of the acrobatic Silky. If I could nitpick, I'd say that this is yet another example of rather uncomfortable sexualization of characters who are clearly minors. I feel like I've had to say that a few more times in this challenge than I was hoping for, and also the fact that the last episode, despite its cliffhanger, really doesn't feel like a final episode, but it's only part 1 of the season, so I guess part 2 will fix that. But yeah, this anime is honestly great, and I was hooked to it. Also, has anyone noticed the parallels between this and ghost stories? You know, teens fighting against supernatural entities, an evil spirit that gets trapped in the body of a cat whereby it becomes a reluctant ally to the protagonists, and heck, the sense of humour in Dandadan, while not the same as Ghost Stories dub, does indeed feel like it demonstrates why that dub really wouldn't be that notable if made these days. Just an observation I made. I put a lot of thought into what I wanted my last film of the challenge to be. Maybe The Boy and the Heron, an anime I'd heard a massive deal made of when it was released. How about Captain Underpants, seeing as I loved the books as a kid? Another Christmas film, seeing as it is the season? Or something that would be just dumb fun like, I don't know, Tag? Or should I not terminate it off the list as another classic I should have seen by now? As it happens, I was overthinking it. I should only ever have had one consideration here. What film I wanted to watch. And I did want to watch all those films for different reasons, but the moment I tried to think too deeply about why I want to watch it, I guess I demonstrate that it isn't the one I want to watch, not really. When I saw that Marcel the Shell with Shoes On was on Netflix, I knew it was the film I wanted to watch. I'd heard it was a great film, and it looked right up my alley, and it certainly was. One of the most impressive parts of the film was how natural it all felt. The conversations with Marcel and Dean are so seamless that I could actually believe that these two were just talking to each other with no prompting, if it weren't for the fact that Marcel is an inch tall and also a shell with shoes on. The friendship between them and Connie is entirely believable. I also think that there's a lot of relatability in the characters. Marcel, who wants to survive for himself and his grandmother, but ends up being far too closed off to taking risks, even when there aren't really any risks at all. Connie, who is clearly struggling in the last days of her life, but is trying to carry on for the sake of Marcel so he doesn't worry. And Dean, who has just come out of a long-term relationship and is struggling to open himself up to people. Dean tries to keep in the background for most of the story, but Marcel and Connie ensure that he can't hide away from it and has to confront it, even if Marcel is ultimately the focus of the story. As well as being a touching and contemplative story, this is also just a beautiful film. The world is mostly viewed from a smaller scale, from where Marcel would see it, and this allows an ordinary household to shine in a way you wouldn't expect. Seeing how Marcel uses different parts of the household, like a whisk or honey, to fulfill purposes only his smaller self would need was great. And Marcel himself is adorable, in both design and how he's voiced. It's a really sweet film and certainly worthy of capping off the films in this challenge. Ever since Super Mario Galaxy, there has been one thing about space that has fascinated me. And not even Galaxy in general, just one of the galaxies. Space Jump Galaxy. It's the one galaxy that truly embraces what space is. It's massive, unending, isolating. You can see billions, maybe trillions, maybe even more miles in any direction. For all you would ever know, there could be not another living soul in all that distance. How would you ever be able to find that out? And yet that galaxy feels claustrophobic. The massiveness feels suffocating. There's a beautiful dichotomy between these two feelings that merge into one. Orbital captures that idea in a way I love. I've never read a Booker Prize winning book, so I figured that as my last book of the year, this would be a great way to go. I loved that there was the contrast between how massive space is outside the shuttle, and yet how small the interior was, and how that played into the emotions the characters felt. This was very much a book exploring what happens to these astronauts and cosmonauts internally. Not much actually happens, it's all introspection. And yet, that's enough, because can anyone really imagine what that must feel like? I did find it was often a bit much for me. So much description and very little dialogue, with the dialogue itself not even being separated by speech marks. I found this created a disconnect at times for me, and while I could appreciate it, I certainly couldn't to the fullest extent. But maybe that was the point. Or maybe I found my limit in terms of what kinds of literature I can fully access, but either way, I'm glad I tried with this. But beyond all else, I finished the book and realised that that was it. The date is the 26th of December, and I have completed my 24 media challenge. I've never really felt like I had my life together, not in the memories I have anyway. I had a mostly very happy upbringing, although I was never popular, and there was a period of time where I was quite badly bullied. I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who I wanted to be in the view of other people. I mean, I also struggled with depression, anxiety, and almost certainly some, as of now, still undiagnosed neurodivergence. When I went to university, I felt isolated due to being away from my family and most of my new uni friends living off campus. And my grandma died during my first year exams. That didn't help. I lost the shreds of identity I'd managed to create for myself up to that point and became a husk of myself. After uni, I was still picking up the pieces from all that and trying to figure out what I wanted to do while still trying to decide who I wanted to be as well. And just as I started to feel like I was making steps in that direction, COVID hit and I had to start all over again from there. Maybe I'm painting a very grim picture of my life, but overall I think I've had things pretty lucky. I've always had family and friends who loved me, a comfortable life, and good prospects that I've always managed to mostly fulfill. But the internal struggle has always been there. It never really left, still hasn't to this day. But from around 2022, something changed. Or not something, many things. I made the right friend, which put me on a path that led me to where I am today. 2024 has not been the greatest year of my life, certainly not. It hasn't been the most important, but standing in the embers of this year, looking back at where I've been and where I am now, I can say with confidence that it's the year that I finally started to feel like I mostly have it all together. Right here, right now, things are good. Most things are. In fact, there aren't many things that are bad, not really. And even more than any of that, it's because I've put the work into it. At the beginning of the year, I was still struggling at work. I was still living with my family. I was still fat and giving myself the vague promise that, yes, this time will be the time I finally get onto a good path with my weight loss. This year, I finally moved out of my family home, not just temporarily, like uni, but possibly for good. I started to get really, really good at my job and gained so much more confidence in myself. I joined a gym and have gone almost every week since, multiple times a week. I'm still fat, but I'm losing weight, so it counts as a win. I had a video that hit, at time of writing, over 150,000 views, which still baffles me. I also hit, again, at time of writing, almost 1,000 subscribers, which is somehow more baffling to me. I've made friends, I've lost friends, I've reconnected with friends, and somehow that's sometimes been with the same person. I booked a trip to Australia and cancelled a trip to Australia and steeled myself with the fact that I will still go there through hell or high water. I spent hours building a pub in the back garden with my family. I was Santa in his grotto and then I was ill over Christmas. I've had my heart broken and I've broken hearts. Okay, that might be an exaggeration, but I'm trying to find parallels, okay? I've had periods when the money in my bank account was practically zero. I've had nights out and nights in, and days out and days in. I've lived in the moment and I've planned for the future. Sitting here right now, I feel like I am the person I've wanted to be my whole life. This might not seem to be all that relevant, but the reality is that when I look back at this year, So many of those memories will be tied to the media I consumed. I discovered my favourite book this year, which is pretty special in itself, but so much of the media I've decided to engage with for this challenge has been a direct result of me wanting to try something someone dear to me gave or recommended to me, or a reaction to, or a result of something that has happened in my year. When my car was taken for a month for repairs and I had to take an hour's walk to and from work every day, I spent that time texting my friends, one of which told me all about the 3-body problem in that time. When my Smash video blew up, I got so many comments talking about how I'd included the Netflix trio for Castlevania, which made me want to try and watch that series again. When I was preparing for moving out, I would watch movies like Bullet Train to keep me occupied. When I had one of my lowest times, mourning what seemed to be the loss of 2 separate friendships, unpacking helped me through it. These aren't just things I enjoyed or didn't this year, these in part tell a story of my year. One that probably only I will be able to appreciate in its rawest form, but a beautiful one nonetheless. And I think that's part of why I wanted to do this challenge and make this video, even if it wasn't a conscious desire. It was absolutely partly because I wanted to improve my media consumption and make it overall more healthy and diverse. And not only has that definitely happened, but I think that it's also been part of why I've been able to make such big strides this year. But I also wanted to be able to tell the story of my year to the world in maybe a relatively abstract way, but in a way that I will always be proud of. I will always remember 2024 and I will always feel grateful for it and what it has done for me. But it's realistically a prequel. 2025 is going to be the one where things come together for me fully. I can feel it. Everything I want to achieve, I will. And I can't wait for that. But it also excites me that many of you will be along for the ride with me too. Watch this space because your boy Slade is going to smash 2025 and I cannot wait to see what it brings me. Thank you for watching, Happy New Year, and I hope you all have the most wonderful of 2025s too.